Can you go with God on his screen? Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 p.m. on August the 1st, and we'd like to welcome all of you to this conversation regarding the Integrated Resource Plan that Southwestern Public Service will be filing in October with the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. We're so glad you could join us. And I'm going to ask that the conference room please go on mute if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. And Deb, you can troubleshoot if they're having any difficulty. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this meeting this afternoon. The meeting is being recorded so that you can review portions that you'd like to later, or people who cannot be here today can still get the benefit of the information that's being presented and discussed. We're very excited about this 2 days of conversation this afternoon and tomorrow morning. And I'm Margie Tatro with GridWorks. I'm joined by my GridWorks colleagues, Jay Griffin and Deborah Shields, who are part of our facilitation team. And we're glad to be here with you today. Our plan for today is shown on this next slide. We have a very full agenda. And that agenda includes, after this welcome and some discussion about some schedule change announcements, we'll talk about the input to the statement of need. And you'll hear more about that. We're using two different mechanisms for that input to be collected. One of them is the statement of need document that a small working group has been putting together. And the second is a priority needs worksheet that we've devised to help hear from all of you stakeholders about what you believe is the most important set of needs in this new portfolio for the utility going forward. Then we'll spend the bulk of this afternoon between 2 and 5 p.m. with 2 breaks built in as needed to hear about not only the modeling assumptions status that the SPS team has dialed in those inputs and assumptions and wanted to keep this group informed about that, but also they're going to share the draft modeling results to date so that we all can become more familiar with what the analyses are and what they are starting to indicate for the future. At 5 p.m., we will take an evening recess until the next morning at 9 a.m. We'll have a very short, quick homework assignment, and that is this priority needs worksheet we'll talk more about. If you could do that overnight so that we can compile the results and present those tomorrow, Wednesday, when we begin, that would be great. We'll reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow, Wednesday, on this same Zoom channel to continue our conversation, insights, observations, and follow-up questions on the modeling results to date. So that will overflow till tomorrow. And then at 10:15, the SPS team has agreed to share their synopsis, conclusions about what the stakeholder requested modeling runs are going to be and the parameters that define those. And so they'll describe those. We'll have a break. And then we will share with you the results of this priority needs worksheet that we're going to ask you to fill out overnight. We'll summarize and adjourn by noon tomorrow. I'd like to thank you all for your patience in this virtual platform. If you're having any trouble or problems or concerns, please send a chat note to Deborah Shields so that she can help troubleshoot. And also James and Linda and many of our SPS colleagues are in a conference room there in Hobbs, New Mexico with a few of our stakeholders. And so if there's any problems with any platform, please contact Deborah and she will troubleshoot that as we go forward for the next today and tomorrow. The next slide shows what we're attempting to do in these 2 days. Really are preparing all of the stakeholders for providing input to the action plan. That's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in terms of what is going to go into the action plan for the IRP. And we will be prepared to do that in September. But first, we need to be informed by the modeling results that will inform that action plan conversation. So our outcomes for today are a measure of consensus regarding the priority needs of stakeholders, and that's where this worksheet's going to come in. We'll also understand the modeling inputs and assumptions that the SPS team is using for modeling. We'll get some insights from the modeling results to date, and then gain our awareness of the stakeholder requested modeling runs, which are an element of the new IRP facilitated stakeholder process. Defines that stakeholders can request modeling runs. We've gone through a process to elicit those suggestions, refine those suggestions, narrow down the number of runs, and the SPS team will talk a little bit about what those runs will entail as we go forward. So my next slide has got a few meeting schedule change announcements. The first one is that August 29th is a new time. We're going to extend that meeting. It was previously scheduled from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Mountain Time. We're going to extend it from 1 to 5 p.m. because that will be another very in-depth conversation about all the modeling results to date. And that final conversation on those results, we feel it's important to spend the time to understand that. Then we've added a meeting on September 13th as a new meeting. This is going to be from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. We will begin our conversation about ideas for the action plan. And so that's why we wanted to insert that between the August meeting and the late September meeting. Also, we've kept the September 21st meeting as unchanged from 1 to 5 p.m., where we will dial in and finish our conversation about the action plan. That September 21st will be the last meeting of this group prior to the submission of the integrated resource plan. And then our final meeting of this stakeholder group is October 26th. That's unchanged. And the purpose of that meeting was to hear your input about how this overall process of stakeholder engagement worked for you. And that's from 2 to 3:30 on October 26th. So to orient those of you who might be new to our conversation, let me just remind you where we've come and where we're going. We spent May and June really getting grounded in the reality of the challenges and opportunities presented in the SPS utility space and prepared us for the modeling that is happening now. July and August is really about getting that modeling work done to inform input to the action plan. We also have done work over the past 2 months on the statement of need input, and we will be checking alignment between that document, the priority needs, and the action plan when we have those conversations in September. And then September, October, it's really get that action plan developed, at least the input from the stakeholders for the action plan, give any review that the utility would like to have the stakeholders do of particular sections if they need that for the IRP before it gets submitted in the middle of October. So that's where we've come. That's where we're going. The meetings as we've got scheduled in the new schedule are also on this slide. So let me pause here and ask, before we jump into the statement of need discussion, are there any questions, any comments, anything that's unclear about where we're going today and where we're headed over the next 2 months? Please raise your hand or type into chat. Either one is okay. In this case, it's probably easiest if you come off mute, raise your hand, and we'll ask for your question here of clarification or questions you might have about our process. Okay, I don't, yeah, Athena, go ahead, please.
Sorry. So in the light that we've moved from global warming to global boiling, is there anything else that's going to be brought in? Can we bring anything in play that's going to kind of readjust how this process is going? Would you suggest any sort of venue or methodology?
Say more, Athena, about the stakeholder engagement process.
Yeah, the stakeholder engagement process. I've been on this one for P&M and for the SPS, and this is my first time with them, so I'm not quite as familiar with their problems and issues. But it seems to me that there's still not the urgency in the electricity sector to decarbonize as fast as possible. And maybe I'll see differently in the next expression with the whatever we're doing today. I've already forgotten. Model runs.
Right. Yeah, Athena, I think that that's an important point, and that's obviously one of the reasons that the stakeholders in both these IRPs requested a look at an accelerated carbon-free electricity grid scenario. Obviously, that's not what the New Mexico law entails currently. So I think both utilities have been open to the idea of looking at that scenario of an acceleration of a carbon-free grid, but I don't know that there's anything that this process can change in terms of the requirements that the state has in place. We certainly can reflect that in the report about going forward to consider these kinds of urgent issues in a different way. But I don't know that that's specifically part of the facilitated stakeholder process, except for hearing from all you to say that that's something that's important. That certainly will get documented in this report.
Thank you for listening.
Sure. Thanks, Athena, for bringing that up. All right, let's, I also want to remind everyone that the materials for this meeting, both before and after, are posted on the gridworks.org website, as they are for each meeting. So if there's materials that you need, for instance, this presentation, the presentations from the SPS team, the latest version of the input statement of need input document, you can find all of those on the GridWorks website. So let me shift now. Many of you have been involved in writing a document that's got elements describing some needs in the statement of need input document. We're not going to go through that today. There were only a few changes that you all suggested from the July 6th meeting and post that meeting, and those changes have been incorporated in the document. And what we have, we will definitely revisit that document when we start talking about the action plan and seeing the modeling results when they're completed. So that's information that will be recorded and documented from input from stakeholders. In addition, we decided, in order to check consensus about what the stakeholders' priority needs are, that we've devised a short worksheet, spreadsheet, sort of a Google form document that has 12 different needs identified that we've heard from a variety of places. We heard this from the conversation about the statement of need. We also referred to the IRP rule appendix A that has some considerations to think about, and discussions by all of you in prior meetings. So what we're going to ask you to do this evening, and even as you're listening to the discussion today on the modeling results, we'd like to ask you to take 5 minutes to go to the link that Deb has provided in the chat and that Linda can make available to those there in Hobbs. And we'd ask that our non-utility stakeholder friends, please go in and put your 5 top priorities that are needs that you believe should be represented in this plan. You can see them listed on this slide here, and they range from affordability and reliability all the way through investments in local communities. And there is a category that you can put an other, some need that's not on this list that you believe is important. So we're going to ask you this evening to go to this worksheet and put in your top 5 factors that you believe are priority needs. We will collect the results without attribution. Well, when you fill out the form, please put in your name and your organization. GridWorks will collect the data. We will not share the attribution with anyone, but we will share the compilation of results with all stakeholders and with SPS, so it can give us a sense of where the priority needs are from this group. So this result plus the statement of need document that's being drafted will be 2 elements that can inform input into the statement of need. And this was our mechanism for checking consensus to find where there is a group consensus on the needs that are highest priority to all of you. So I'm not going to say more about this because you'll experience a very quick and short spreadsheet Google form that has these elements and a place for a write-in. And again, we will share the results in the morning to see where there's the greatest set of needs, where the consensus is in terms of which needs are most important to all of you, the stakeholders. So we very much would like your input into that at any time before 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Before we close today, we'll remind you of this and encourage you to do that short exercise. I will show you here for a moment what the actual form looks like. It just says that it's capturing the priority needs of stakeholders, and we would not be sharing your identification in your response, just the result of these 5 factors. You can write in another category, and section 2 of the worksheet is your name, organization, and email. So we struggled with finding a way to measure consensus on a very broad and complex topic like the statement of need. And as many of you have seen in the document, it is quite extensive in terms of things to consider going forward. And we knew it would be very difficult to gain overall consensus from stakeholders on the diversity in that document. So this is our attempt to complement that document with some measurable priority sets. So let me stop and say, before we go into the modeling conversation, any questions about this statement of need exercise and the combination of those 2 documents to help inform the utilities' sets of decisions as they move forward? Please raise your hand or enter into chat any question you might have. Yeah, Gary, please go ahead.
Hi, just curious, the top 5 factors for priority needs. If I mark other, it occurs to me that that's not going to make the top 5 priorities because it's an other. So if I had something like, capacity and resiliency, the ability to handle the electrification of everything and making sure that we don't lose energy as we electrify everything and depend on it for our lives. How would that get in to this if it's an other? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, Gary, so what we'll do is we'll read the entrance, the the responses on other that people put in, and we might just collect those as a list. There may be some from people that are similar, so we'll just include those as another list. Obviously, other people won't be able to vote on your particular entry because they won't see it, but we will definitely report it. And it's possible that there may be similar responses that would be aggregated into a greater score because multiple people mention it. So we'll just deal with those as the one-offs and look for themes that are common. Gary, thanks for offering that idea. See, Cynthia, go ahead and you're Cynthia Mitchell from New Mexico PRC. Would you like to ask your question?
Or you can just read it, Margie. I just wanted to know, are you going to develop a donut weighting scheme similar to PNM?
And who are you asking that to?
I was asking it to you because you're asking for the.
Yeah, okay. The answer is no, we are not going to put a weighting on these priority criteria, these needs. We are going to, though, give that set of information to SPS, and they can use it however they would like to use it. So, Brooke, do you want to respond to this? Let's see, I think the EDC meeting room is on mute. So while they're getting that corrected, Cynthia, so the answer is no, we are not developing a weighting scheme.
Okay, well, and I can just find out from PNM or SPS tomorrow what they want to do with it if they have any idea then.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm gonna give Brooke a minute as she's got
additional capacity generation. All right, we are unmuted. You want to talk? Hi, Margie. Thanks. I was responding to the question about the other box. And correct me if you think it's wrong, but I think the box for reliability and resiliency would be a good category to select if stakeholders want to identify additional generation capacity as a top priority. We would certainly characterize reliability and resiliency as additional capacity, but wanted to make sure GridWorks agreed.
I think we'll let the stakeholders decide how they want to give their input into this, and we'll see what comes out of it, Brooke, and then we'll just share with you the full list of responses. Great. Okay, thank you. Again, please feel free to go to that worksheet whenever it's you feel inspired after 5 o'clock, or if we're on a break today and you feel like you want to get your input in. We'll be monitoring that at the end of the day, and look forward to your responses there. So with that, let me turn the meeting over to Jay Griffin, my colleague, who will facilitate this next section and introduce the SPS team. So Jay, over to you.
Thanks, Margie. Good afternoon, everyone. As Margie said, we're going to go through a pretty substantial amount of material here. So first, I want to thank the SPS team for preparing that. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion this afternoon. The first half, and those presentations have been posted on the GridWorks website. So if you haven't seen that yet, please go there. You can download and follow on your own. The first half of the conversation will focus on a set of updated input assumptions that SPS has put together for this current set of modeling runs. So Ben will run through that. We're targeting about 55 minutes for that material. We'll take a break and then run through questions. And so as we have in the past, please submit your questions in the chat. We'll keep a list of them. And on this one, we're going to be do our best to manage that question and answer period within the 25 minutes there, so that we allow enough time for the rest of the afternoon to go through the second set of results, the second part of the presentation, which will focus on the modeling results that SPS has done to date. So I think you'll find there'll be a ton to dig into and discuss there. So we want to make sure we allow enough time for that. And so that's the broad overview of our structure. Look forward to the conversation and everyone's feedback here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Hey, thank you, Jay. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Tell me for 1 second. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the presentation.
See it then.
Was that a yes, sorry, Zoe?
We can see it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. And then Jay, just kind of a procedural matter. I cannot see the comments as I'm presenting, so we'll probably have to just circle back to the comments when I get done. And then also, I probably won't be 50-50 split. I'll probably be ahead of schedule when we talk about the inputs, and then I'm sure we'll require the time when we look at the modeling results.
Perfect. Yeah,
So,
I'll monitor. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So before I get started, just a couple of important notes that we need to talk about. So first of all, our modeling for the scenarios we're presenting today, we consider near complete. In other words, all of the inputs and assumptions are the final inputs and assumptions that we're going to use for the IRP. However, over the next month, we will continue to go through the models. We're going to check for accuracy. We're going to check for any errors that's been incorporated into the model. So there could be some changes between the model results we present today and then what we present at the end of August. We will obviously circle back if we find any mistakes or any errors, and then we will represent the results in a kind of a streamlined fashion at the end of August. But just keep in mind these results can change even though the inputs and assumptions are near final. And then the other thing I wanted to just bring up quickly now, and this is perhaps maybe the most important statement I'm going to make this afternoon. So we have modeled everything based on the generic cost of resources. So in other words, of an estimate of what new resources is going to cost. So how much is new wind going to cost in 2027? How much is new solar generation going to cost in 2028, for example? All of those assumptions are based or are dependent upon, I should say, these resources actually showing up to a future RFP and at those price points. And I'll maybe give you an example. As we start looking through these modeling results, you're going to see there's a slight preference for wind generation over solar generation within our modeling. Now that's predominantly because according to the NREL data, wind generation is lower cost than solar generation. So when we issue an RFP next year, if we see solar generation coming in maybe slightly lower than NREL was projecting, wind slightly higher, you could certainly see that pendulum swing where we maybe see more solar resources than we do wind resources. And I'm going to circle back to that throughout this presentation. Just keep in mind, kind of the highlight right now is just all of the modeling results are dependent upon a future RFP. So these are the scenarios that SPS proposed to model as part of the IRP. We are going to discuss tomorrow in pretty good detail the stakeholder requests, but for today, we're just presenting the SPS scenarios that have been completed. So first of all, I'll start on the right actually. For the load forecast, we have 3 different load forecasts. The modeling that's been complete to date is the financial forecast. And I'm going to talk about more of the financial forecast more on the next slide. All of the scenarios we've done today are based on our base natural gas assumptions. And I'm going to cover our natural gas forecast later in this presentation. And then also $300 per kW transmission network upgrade costs. So again, all of the modeling is based on these scenarios.
Ben, we lost your audio for a moment. Are you still there?
Okay, can people hear me again?
Yes, thank you, Ben.
Okay, so I'm not sure what happened there. It seemed to drop. So anyway, that's the end of the presentation. I think we can all go home. And then we got a few more slides to go through. So hang on, let me get back to sharing. Okay. So I'm not sure I lost you. I think where it kind of went dead on my end, I was just explaining the modeling we're presenting today is the financial load forecast, which is our most conservative load forecast, our base natural gas price assumptions, and then also the $400 a kW transmission network upgrade costs. On the left, you see the checkboxes. We have actually completed 5 of the scenarios. So we have modeled the multi-jurisdictional baseline. And again, I'm going to cover kind of this scenario later in the presentation. We've also completed the analysis in which we only allow wind, solar, 4, 6, and 8-hour batteries. And also the analysis where we allow long duration storage on top. And we have done that for...
Yeah, we
Sorry,
can't.
Ben. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Now we're sharing.
Okay. So we have done that for both the existing resource adequacy requirements within the SPP, so the 15% resource adequacy requirement, and then also a proposed increased resource adequacy scenario in which we evaluate a speculative 18% summer PRM in 20% winter PRM. I say speculative, this is based on kind of conversations we've had within the SPP working groups where a further increase in the PRM is looking likely. We just don't know exactly what that number is going to look like. So first of all, I said we're going to talk about the updated load and energy assumptions. So circling back to what I was talking about earlier with our financial forecast. So first of all, probably the most important input or assumption that goes into a production cost model is the load forecast. We typically break that out into 2 components. We break that out into demand in energy, with energy being a megawatt hour value, so total sales over the course of a year, in this case 20 years when we look at planning period, and then demand, which is the instantaneous energy requirement at a point in time. So we're usually talking about peak demand. So in SPS's case, we're a summer peaking utility, which means right about 5 p.m., 6 p.m. in the middle of July or August, we have our maximum demand for our customers. We're really planning the system to this maximum load requirement. We are going to be modeling, as I mentioned earlier, 3 different load assumptions in the IRP. Our financial forecast, which is our most conservative load forecast. Our planning forecast, which is a medium load forecast. And then our emerging technologies and electrification forecast, which would be a high case. So again, just to reiterate, all of our modeling we're presenting today is the financial forecast. So if you're kind of thinking of this as bookends, this is going to be on the lower side. So when we start talking about resource need under the financial forecast, because it's the most conservative, this will be the fewest amount of resources we need. As we step up through the planning and then the emerging technologies forecast, you're going to see our resource need increases. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is these numbers are different to our most recent meeting, to our previous meeting. These load forecasts was updated in the last couple of weeks, so these are brand new numbers that we're presenting today. So if you go back to previous slides, you may see this, our capacity position is different in today's meeting than it has been prior because this is a new load forecast. So on that note, SPS releases 2 load forecasts per year. We release a spring load forecast and a summer load forecast. So as I just mentioned, what we're presenting today is our summer 2023 load forecast. This is what's shown with this dark blue line on the graph here. So again, our most conservative load forecast over a 20-year period, and we're talking peak demand. So right now, approximately 4,300 megawatts peak demand in 2024, increasing through load growth to about 5,300 megawatts by 2043. What I've also shown on this graph is this dark red line here. This was our corresponding load forecast. So again, our financial forecast, we refer to it as our base forecast in our 2021 IRP. So what you can see between 2021 and today is quite a significant increase in load projections. So right now we're projecting an extra 838 megawatts in load growth between our 2021 forecast and our current load forecast. What you'll see with this red dashed line here was our high load forecast from our 2021 IRP. So if you look out into the future, when you get to maybe the late 2030s, you see these two forecasts they kind of merge, they become one. But what you're actually seeing in the earlier years through the mid-30s is today, our financial forecast, so our conservative forecast today is 327 megawatts higher than our high load forecast from 3 years ago. What's causing that is the load growth we have talked about at every other meeting we've had so far. We are experiencing significant load growth within SPS, particularly in Southeast New Mexico, and that's what's really driving the increase in load between 2021 and today. All of these other very minor dashed lines that you can see on this chart really show each of the load forecasts we've released between the 2021 IRP and today. And all of them pretty much go up in chronological order, so you can pretty much see every time we've released a load forecast, that load forecast has stepped up. The other thing that I'm showing on this chart is kind of this period here between 25 and 26, where it would appear that we have this plateau or even a slight decrease in demand. I want to make it clear that that's not kind of a drop in expectation. What that actually is some of our remaining wholesale load actually leaves the SPS system. So we're still experiencing growth during this period, but we actually see some wholesale load dropping off, which appears when you're looking at total load requirements that we have kind of a plateau or a slight reduction. The other important thing, as I mentioned earlier, there's really two components to a load forecast. We have demand, then we have energy sales. So what we're looking at here on this graph is our energy sales, again, under our most conservative load forecast. So right about now, going into 2024, we expect to have around 29 million megawatt hours in sales across SPS's entire system. So that's Texas, New Mexico, and wholesale. By 2043, you're going to see sales increase to about 37 million megawatt hours. Again, just reiterate, I'm going to say this multiple times during the course of this afternoon's meeting, this is under our financial forecast. Our most conservative assumptions still see a significant increase in energy sales over a 20-year period. And then another important thing to note is this does not include the energy that's required to charge battery energy storage devices. So batteries are not generators. Batteries do not generate electricity. Batteries take energy from a period in time, convert and store energy, and then release it at a future point in time. So not only does a battery kind of solve energy requirements, it also increases your load requirements. So as we add batteries to the system, you're also going to see in some of the slides later that we have much more generation, much more energy being produced in order to charge those batteries. And then this is a very brief or a high-level snapshot of our loads and resources table. So what you're going to see here is I kind of highlighted a couple of periods which I think are of particular interest. 24 through 27, which is highlighted in green. This is part of the action plan period, is the IRP, so 24 through 26 is the action plan. And we also, as everyone's aware, or hopefully most people are aware on this call, in November of 2022, we issued an RFP for new generation. The RFP targeted our capacity need in 24 through 27. So the RFP that was issued in November and concluded in June of this year, and we actually filed CCN for approval of these resources recently, will solve our capacity need through 2027 if that CCN is approved. Even still, we have a very large and growing capacity need in the late 20s, going through to the 30s, and then going into the early 40s. So right now, as we focus through the end of this decade, you're going to see we have an approximately 2,300 megawatt capacity need. Now, again, a couple of things to keep in note, saying the same thing over and over again. This is our financial load forecast. So this is our most conservative assumption. As we look at additional load forecasts, this number will increase. Furthermore, this is the accredited capacity need. So we need 23 megawatts of capacity. Doesn't mean we can go and procure 23 or 2,300 megawatts, excuse me, of wind generation, and we solve our capacity need. We have to procure accredited capacity. So if you're looking at solving a 2,300 megawatt accredited capacity need, and you're looking at a mixture of wind, solar, batteries, then you're going to need significantly more resources, nameplate to resolve this capacity need. And then this is kind of another concept that I want to just introduce before we start going into the modeling results. And that's the difference between dispatchable resources and then variable energy resources, which you could also term as renewable resources. So right now, this is our current portfolio, not including any new generation, so just resources that are available today. And this is on an accredited capacity perspective. So this is not nameplate generation, this is accredited capacity. Right now, we have our dispatchable resources that exceed our peak load and just shy of our plan and reserve margin requirements. These dispatchable resources are exclusively coal or gas generation. Now, when we talk about dispatchable resources, we're talking about resources that can provide energy when they're called upon. So they're not dependent upon, obviously, you know, the wind blowing or the sun shining. This means when you need generation, the SPP can call the operator up at the plant and say, hey, we need you to turn your generator on, and it can turn on. So that's dispatchable capacity. And then we have variable energy resources or renewable energy resources, intermittent resources, however you want to refer to them. And then we have wind and solar obviously fall into that category. Those type of resources are obviously dependent upon natural resources. So they're dependent upon the wind blowing, on the sun shining. So that's why you see, even though we actually have significant more nameplate renewable resources, we're not getting the amount of accredited capacity from those renewable resources. I'm going to touch upon the difference between dispatchable resources and renewable resources as we start looking at the modeling results, so I don't want to spend too much time on the slide right now. So continuing on the inputs and assumptions updates that we've gone through this model, as we talked about when we were down in Roswell, we are relying upon NREL and NREL's annual technology baseline cost assumptions for projecting the cost of wind and solar resources going forward. We had mentioned previously that NREL were due to do an update to those cost assumptions in the kind of the third week of July, and it wasn't available during our last meeting. NREL has since updated their cost assumptions, and we can incorporate those cost assumptions into the model. So what you're going to see here is NREL's cost assumption in the dotted line, and we'll start with wind generation. The only change that we have made to NREL's assumption is by converting them to real to nominal dollars. So what you'll see NREL's projections are, and I'll be honest with you, I think these projections are on the low side, and that's why I mentioned earlier, everything's going to be subject to an RFP. But once you incorporate production tax credits, NREL believes the base cost of wind without any transmission network upgrades would be just shy of $10 in 2028, and those costs would fall to approximately $588 in 2043. Now, as I mentioned, that does not include transmission network upgrade costs. If we look at this light blue line, this is the adjusted cost stream when you include $400 a kW for transmission network upgrades. Everything we're presenting today is based on this light blue line, which is the $400. The dark blue line is based on $600 a kW. So this dark blue line will have to present at future meetings at the end of August. Likewise, when we look at solar generation, again, using NREL's data, all we've done is convert it from real to nominal dollars. You will see the starting point for solar generation, including a production tax credit, is 1886 a megawatt hour. and that falls over time to kind of sub 10 in 2043, so going down to $8. Again, what we're modeling today, what we're presenting today is with $400 a kW transmission network upgrades on top. So you're looking at around $33 going down to $28. Future meetings will present the $600 a kW scenario. For battery energy storage, NREL do present the different durations that we are modeling. So we're modeling 4 hours, 6 hours, and 8 hours. Unfortunately, NREL do their cost assumptions slightly different for batteries. These costs that we're looking at here are what we call levelized cost of energy for wind and solar. So these are all in cost. It means it includes the cost to build the generation and the cost to maintain and operate the generation. When NREL present their battery data, they present it slightly differently. They present it based on the capital expenditure and then also the fixed O&M assumptions. So what they're saying here, for example, is inclusive of an investment tax credit, in 2029, the cost of installing a 4-hour battery is just over $1,000 a kW. A 6-hour battery is $1,500 a kW. An 8-hour battery is somewhat shy of $2,000. You see those costs tend to pick up in the outer years. I believe that's as the ITC probably steps away. I've not checked that. And then they present the ongoing cost to operate a battery on a fixed O&M basis. So these are the costs on an annual basis, on a kW year basis for a battery energy storage device. So if we look at a 4-hour battery in 2028, they're looking at $38.50 per kW year for operate the battery. So these slides that I present today are coming straight from the NREL annual technology baseline. The NREL data is available publicly. You can just go to their website. You can download this cost information directly from NREL's website. The other important facet or variable that we need to consider when we are looking at renewable energy and battery energy storage is their effective load carrying capability. So now what we're talking about is accredited capacity. I kind of touched upon that earlier. So accredited capacity is kind of a metric. It's a measurement of how a generating resource type, for example, wind, would contribute towards a peak system. Let me maybe provide that or provide some additional context there, state it differently. Is when we look at wind generation in particular, wind is a fantastic energy resource. So wind has what we call about a 50% capacity factor for energy. So it's producing energy on quite a regular basis. However, when you look at hours of high wind production, they don't particularly align well with peak demand. In other words, winds typically generate in the early hours of the morning, in the spring, maybe in the fall and the winter, but it's not particularly generating on those hot summer days when we have the highest energy consumption, the highest peak demand. So the Southwest Power Pool are actually responsible for these studies. The Southwest Power Pool do what they call loss of load expectations, and then they do ELCC studies. And it's all to determine the value that wind, solar, and batteries would get when you start calculating their benefit towards peak demand. So wind generation gets around about 15% in 2028 and stays pretty much constant. So what that means is in the summer, when you look at wind generation, if you put on a 100 megawatt wind farm, you can count about 15 megawatts of that wind farm towards your summer peak to your plan and reserve margin requirement. So wind, even though it's a great energy resource, is not a particularly strong capacity resource. When we look at solar generation, solar, as you can imagine, the profile with solar generation is more aligned to system peaks. When it's hot and sunny outside and people have got their air conditioners running, typically solar generation is going to be producing more during those period of times. So what we look at with solar generation is solar generation has about a 65% accredited capacity in 2028. And that falls over time as more solar generation is added to the SPP footprint. So again, use the same example. 100 megawatts of solar gives you about 65 megawatts of accredited capacity. Then over time, that's going to fall to around like 40%, so 40 megawatts. Keep in mind, this is summer values. We've also got a plan for the winter. When we look at the winter, solar generation obviously falls off. You know, the peak in the winter is typically going to be early in the morning, late in the evening. So the peak then doesn't so much align with solar generation. And then at the top here, we have different battery durations. So we have a 4-hour battery in the orange here. So it's starting off pretty high. So it's starting off from nearly 100%. I think it's around 97% for a 4-hour battery. And then as additional batteries are added to the SPP footprint, you're going to see this accreditation drop off. Then what we see here in the kind of in the black and the red, and they kind of just so closely down, you really can't see the difference at the moment, is a 6-hour and 8-hour battery. So what this is saying is essentially, yes, as we've seen on previous slides, a 6 or an 8-hour battery is more expensive than a 4-hour battery. It also gets more accredited capacity. So before I go any further, Jay, I'm not going to ask questions for the group, but I've received a few text messages that I can't see. I just want to make sure there's no questions, maybe from the Excel team first, and then I'll get through the rest of the slides, and then we'll open it up to the stakeholders.
Well, look, yeah, we have a number of questions in the queue. Were you saying there you had questions from the Excel team or comment? Or,
well, I just wanted to make, at the moment, I can't see any of the chat that's coming in or any other medium that's coming to me. So I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any clarification from the people in Hobbs. If not, I can carry on, get through a couple of slides, and then we can throw it over to the chat questions.
Okay, yeah. So folks in the room at Hobbs, are there any comments, clarifications you want to make? And then, yeah, I was holding off on the questions because it looks like, you know, we're well ahead of time. You only have a few more, so we'll have ample time for taking everyone's questions. But quickly, if we want to check in the room at Hobbs.
Did y'all have any questions?
I think we're good here. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Okay. Think we can proceed, Ben. We got plenty waiting for you. So
I'm sure.
but
I didn't
you're on a roll. So keep going. Thanks.
Okay. So again, that is kind of the assumptions for new resources, and particularly renewable resources where we're relying upon NREL's data, and I'm classifying batteries as a renewable resource in that statement. And then also the ELCC projected curves from the Southwest Power Pool. As I mentioned earlier, we are also going to be doing sensitivities on natural gas prices and also market energy prices. So again, everything we're presenting today is based upon our base natural gas forecast, which is this dark blue line across the middle. So what you see is, you know, kind of gas today and around that, you know, those high $3, and then increasing to, you know, just over $6, $6.86 per MMBTU by 2043. Because natural gas prices are kind of an important variable within a model, we're also going to do a low case scenario, which is the slightly lighter green line across the base here, and then also a high natural gas price forecast. These are annual averages here on the left. And then on the right, what you see is the same data, but showing on a monthly average. So really the only point of this slide is just to kind of show you that inter-season, that inter-month variability, where we see kind of gas spiking more in the winter months and then kind of dropping off in the summer months. And that's, you know, obviously based on gas demand. And then kind of related to our natural gas price forecast is our market energy price forecast. So we receive our natural gas price forecast from 2 or 3 different external parties. We update the natural gas price forecast twice a year, in the spring and in the fall this time. When we update those natural gas price forecasts, we also update our market energy price forecast. The market energy price forecasts represent what we could purchase energy from the SPP market. And then also if we were to sell energy to the SPP, what we would receive in revenue. So again, as we look here on the left now, these are all annual average numbers. On the left is our on-peak average. On the right is our off-peak average. And again, we're only presenting the base case today. And what you'll see with this dark blue line is kind of market energy prices over time. And this is in nominal dollars, just to be clear, stay pretty consistent, pretty flat, slight decrease over time for on-peak, going from around peaking around $35, or excuse me, $38 down to around $30 per megawatt hour. We see that decrease just as the SPP footprint itself kind of transitions more to renewable resources that have a lower production cost. You know, it's cost $0 to produce energy from a wind and solar resource. And in fact, if you get a production tax credit, those numbers may actually be negative. So you actually see this number declining slightly over time. Again, we're going to present a low case and a high case. We have a little bit of divergence here. In the low case, what you see is a kind of a continued decrease in on-peak market energy price forecast. And then in the high case, you kind of see the opposite, where you see an increase in market energy price forecast. Now, there's kind of two sides of this coin. As market energy prices increase, the cost of purchasing generation from the SPP goes up, but the revenue in which we would receive excess generation also increases. So it doesn't necessarily mean the higher the market energy price forecast, the more expensive a portfolio is. There's going to be that kind of offsetting transaction where you have sales and purchases. And then as we look at the off-peak values, again, dark blue line is kind of what we're showing today. Under the base case assumption, again, stays relatively flat, $25 to $30. Again, nominal dollars over a 20-year period. So if you start looking at real dollars, you're actually probably going to see these declining. And then we have a low case, and then we have a high case. And then just showing the market energy price forecast on a monthly basis, again, similar to the gas forecast, really just to show you that inter-season, inter-monthly variability, where we see quite a stark difference between on-peak and off-peak market energy prices depending on the month. And you see kind of in the dark blue line here in the baseline, in some cases, you actually see a monthly average becoming negative out in the out years of the model. You don't quite see that with the off-peak, but it's still just hovering above zero. So that's all I have for modeling inputs and assumptions. Again, I just want to circle back just real quickly before we throw this open to questions. Is we had committed in prior meetings to, one, update our load forecast. The forecast we're presenting today is our final financial load forecast. It will not change between now and filing the IRP. One slight kind of caveat there is, as we look at DSM scenarios, demand response scenarios, that would be a modifier to this baseline forecast. And we also committed to updating the NREL data. That data has now been updated by NREL. It's available on their website. You can go out and take a look. These charts do summarize it. And then finally, we committed to updating our natural gas and market energy price forecast. So again, that information is included on these slides. So I will pause there, Jay, and I think throw that open to questions.
Great, thanks, Ben. Given that we're ahead of time, that's good. I think we're going to run a couple nice things. Most of the questions are in order by slide, so we can run through, take them that way, Ben. I think we'll run through everyone. We'll go through the Q&A and then take a break, and then pick up with the modeling work. So if that's okay with you, Ben. Our first question is from Cynthia Mitchell on, we have a couple of questions on slide 5 on the demand forecast. So Cynthia, you asked if the high forecast captures the oil and gas Permian electrification forecast per James Hall's model request. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So, sorry, Cynthia, I didn't mean to overspeak there. But yeah, I was just going to say, this high forecast, the emerging technologies and electrification, we going into this process, we had our kind of our own mindset of how we were going to produce this. But based on prior conversations in the information that James Hall has provided, we're essentially going to incorporate the SPP study and use that SPP study that showed the Permian electrification as our high case.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Next, Margie had a question on the, slide. I think it's slide 6. Well, yeah, slide 6, Margie. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thanks. On slide number 6, yeah, could you give our stakeholders a sense for the current, like 2023 summer demand peak, so that it can help them understand where we are today with respect to these forecasts?
So I have not seen the 2023 peak, just because we probably going to peak in July or August, and we've probably not hit that number yet. But if I remember my rate case testimony correctly, in 2022, I think we were somewhere in the region of about 4,200 megawatts to 4,300 megawatts peak. So as we look at the 2021 IRP, we blew through that last year, and we are much more closely aligned with this dark blue line.
Thank you.
Next question is on the slide as well. Cynthia, you want to ask your question here about the load
Well,
duration
yeah.
curve? Yeah.
Let's see, back in May, you showed us a load duration curve where the last 500 hours occurred in the just for 10% of the hours. Are you forecasting or expecting any significant change in your load duration curve? Is it going to flatten out? Is it going to become more peaky? Or do you think it's going to stay about the same?
So that's a great question, Cynthia. I would have to do some research. I don't have a definitive answer right now. What I would potentially say is a lot of the load growth that we're seeing, whether it's electrification in the Permian, whether it's new data centers, has a very high load factor. So they're typically going to be running almost 24/7.
Okay.
So I would imagine that load curve would flatten, but I'll be honest, I've never looked, so we could do some more research there.
I would think so too.
Ben, I just had a quick question on the 3 different forecasts. Do you have a sense of the relative increase? Right, you talk about the conservative, the planning, and then the high electrification. How much higher are each of those, the next 2 over the, you've only shown the conservative here.
Yeah, so I don't know on the electrification. That's something I'll be honest, we've been working, we've had some phone calls with S&P. We're trying to get some information from S&P. So I don't have the electrification. What I'm told, kind of high level, is we expect our planning forecast to have a same or a similar relationship to our financial forecast from the 2021 IRP. So if you look at the difference between the solid red line and the dotted red line from 2021, you would probably see something similar with a dark blue dotted line. So what's the difference here? Maybe 800 megawatts. You would probably see something similar with us peaking around, 6,000 megawatts in the plan. But I have not seen that forecast, Jay. I'm kind of a little bit speculating there.
Okay, oh, that's helpful. Sorry, we'll go back to the ones in the queue here. Jeffrey Pollock, you had a question on slide number 7.
Yeah, hey, Ben, I'm assuming those are energy sales at the generation level?
Yes, so these are energy sales at what we call the source. So they're at the generator. These would be adjusted for line losses.
Okay. And I'm assuming that's based on a sales forecast, and then you'd also have to kind of project what your losses are going to be.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
And do the loss projections, take into account changes in the topography of your transmission system, or you just use a constant loss factor?
I don't know from a forecasting perspective, Jeff, if I'm honest, of how that changes over time. If those transmission loss adjustments change over time, or if they don't, I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Cynthia, you had a question on this slide as well.
Ben, on slide 7, the statement about charging batteries, and that this slide doesn't include the energy for that. And I just want to clarify what I think I already understand is that you don't need additional capacity to charge batteries, but essentially you're using what would otherwise be surplus energy from wind and solar.
Yeah, so Cynthia, I'm probably going to show you a slide that may demonstrate this a little bit later in the presentation. But when we start looking at the scenario where we only have wind and solar and batteries, so no new gas generation, what you see is this huge build out of wind generation. And it looks like you're building out wind above our energy requirements. But what we're really doing, to your point, is we're adding wind to the system to charge those batteries, you know, in the low cost hours, the 2 a.m., the 3 a.m. in the morning. And then that energy is then, or those batteries are then discharging during the peak. So you're exactly right. You're not adding capacity per se, but you need to charge them with energy.
Okay, and that wind energy is just being created regardless if the wind's blowing and you're not using it for actual retail sales at that time, but you're able to charge with it.
Yeah, there's a very dependable relationship between the two. The more batteries you add to the system to solve your capacity need, the more wind you're naturally going to add to charge those batteries. Now, this is where I go back to my earlier comment. I actually think we're probably over modeling wind a little bit compared to solar. I think in reality, you see a more natural blend between wind and solar charging those batteries.
Okay.
Because of our price difference here, what you actually see in our modeling today is more wind charging the batteries than you do solar generation.
Okay, so there is a wind cost to the charging.
Yes, there's not a production cost per se. In other words, there's not a variable cost where the wind is $10 a megawatt hour. What the cost is you have to then build the infrastructure for that wind. Okay. So you build the CapEx, or you enter into a PPA to then charge those batteries. Okay. And that's captured in our model.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. David Millar, you had a question, the change in the NREL assumptions. David, are you available? Let's see, not hearing anything. I think I'll try to ask it, because I had a similar question. Can you give us a rough idea of what the changes are in the NREL assumptions between 2022 and 2023?
I don't have them today. I know that's kind of a deliverable.io. The struggle that we had doing this presentation is the 2022 data was pre-Inflation Reduction Act. The 2023 data includes the updated production and investment tax credit schedules. I don't have that comparison. I know it's been asked for. We'll present that at the August 29th meeting.
Okay. Jeffrey Pollock, you had a question about levelized costs versus what is included in rates.
Slide 11, Ben, just a reference point. He showed a bunch of levelized costs of energy for wind and solar, and I'm assuming that's not what you're going to use when you actually model it, but you tell me.
No, so when we model it, what we will use is the levelized cost. So this light blue line here for wind, and this dark orange line here for solar. Now, I think when you maybe go, Jeff, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we do kind of two approaches. When we do our analyses, we model on our first pass all of our renewable resources on an LCOE basis. Then once the model is selected everything on an LCOE basis, we then lock in that expansion plan and we respin it based on the revenue requirements. So if the wind generation that's selected is a PPA, for example, it will always stay on this LCOE basis unless the bidder in an RFP has given us like an escalating curve. but we would always model a PPA on a dollar per megawatt hour basis. If it's a company owned asset where it essentially gets converted into a revenue requirement, after we lock the expansion plan in, we change those ownership structures, and then we present the results as a revenue requirement. Jeff, did I address your question there?
Yeah, so basically you're gonna model the levelized costs unless the company later decides after selecting a project that they want to own it, in which case it's going to completely change the cost structure. How does that work? I mean, how do we determine that that's a more efficient way to expand your system? If you're not going to model it like a rate-based project, for example, if you're going to assume everything is PPAs, then it just means that expanding by PPA is more cost effective maybe than expanding by, you know, owning resources.
Well, and I think that's the point, Jeff. I think if you model everything on a true apples to apples basis, then what you do is you identify the lowest cost resources over the life of the project. So in this case, over the 20-year planning period and beyond. Once you've worked out what the lowest cost resources are over a multi-year period, that's when you make the trigger to the ownership structure. If you do it the other way around, if you model some resources on a revenue requirements basis and others on a PPA basis, really what you're going to see is a favorability towards company ownership, because you're going to see the impact of those production tax credits in the first 10 years. So that's why you need to model everything apples to apples.
Jeffrey, did that cover? I just have one follow-up, but I want to make sure that Jeffrey, does that cover? Do you have further questions, clarifications on that?
I guess I'm not real sure how that necessarily works, because you're right. I mean, to the extent that your company owns a resource, you're going to get tax credits, and that certainly makes the revenue requirement lower, but you've also got a much higher investment base that you're going to have to offset those tax credits against for a self-build project that you don't have with a PPA. So it seems like the economics aren't always going to favor a company-owned generation. It's going to kind of depend on how much, you know, capital you have to spend and so on and so forth. So how do we know that a rate-based project, I guess, how are you going to demonstrate that a rate-based project, you know, should be undertaken instead of a PPA if you're modeling essentially only PPAs?
Okay, that's, yep, I see where you're going, Jeff. So let me maybe provide some clarification. So what we're talking about today is just what we're going to, I don't want to call it the phase one, but the modeling for the IRP. So in this modeling, we're really not distinguishing between who owns the project, whether it's company ownership, whether it's PPAs, whether it's build transfers. We're just modeling every resource on an apples to apples basis. Now, I think where you're going, Jeff, and to your point, when we issue an RFP at a later date, and this is what we did with our 2022 RFP, we're going to get PPA proposals that come in. Those PPA proposals are typically going to be just a levelized cost. They're going to be $30 a megawatt hour for the life of the project. We will model those dollars using that cost stream. So $30, whether it's escalating or not. When we get company self-build projects, or we get build transfer projects, so projects that ultimately own, SPS ultimately owns, what we do in those projects is we create the revenue requirements model. So we go in over the life of the project, and we enter in all of those assumptions you were just mentioning, the initial CapEx, the ongoing CapEx, the fixed O&M, property taxes, all that fun stuff. And we come up with a revenue requirement all in on an annual basis. So that would be essentially what the customer would pay, that revenue requirement. Then what we do is we convert that revenue requirement to an LCOE basis. So then it's going in on that apples to apples comparison. The model will then select the resources apples to apples with a full in LCOE based on the revenue requirement. And then what we do after the fact is we then go back and we flip it from a LCOE to the revenue requirement, because over the same time period, over a 20-year time period, the net present value is the same. But by doing that way, you actually get to see what the short-term cost impact is to customers. Really hard to explain, Jeff, without being able to do like a spreadsheet or a demonstration. But does that provide any more clarity, like when we look at kind of the RFP approach?
Well, I mean, it seems like you could do it one way or the other way. I see what you're doing, and just seems like in this case, you're going to have to demonstrate that a self-built project is less costly than a PPA, where you ever can build something.
Yes, and we absolutely have to do that when we start doing those RFPs. When we do those RFPs and we know what the ownership structure is looking like I said, we will do a full all-in revenue requirement converted to an LCOE.
Okay,
So the model
thanks.
would know exactly the cost difference.
All right. Thank you, Ben.
Sorry, I don't want to belabor, Ben, I think just to help me clarify, I think, are you talking about different, when you do these different modeling analyses, are you talking about different processes here? And what I mean by that, right? The way I can think about it, doing the modeling now for the IRP and action plan. At a later point in time, you're going to run the RFP and do an evaluation of different projects and their economics. And then, a third subsequent stage is when you submit these to the commission for decision making. I just want to make sure we're not kind of mixing between these three and that it's clear exactly what's done at this stage. I mean, what I understood is that you're taking these, ownership agnostic LCOE numbers and developing, your long-term projections to scope, the RFP plus other action, other elements of the action plan, but it is, assumed to be agnostic to ownership. Is that clear enough?
Yes, that is 100% correct, Jay. Without issuing RFP, without knowing what the ownership structure looks like, we just have for our IRP modeling, just kind of an apples to apples comparison where we are, as you point out, agnostic to the ownership structure. So everything that we model for renewables for the IRP is based purely on an LCOE basis. There's no assumption for who physically owns the generator and how we get cost recovery.
Jeffrey, does that help clarify? I mean, I think that was some of the confusion for me. Ben was explaining how those analyses differ, but they're separated by different parts of the process, right? The way I would think of three different processes.
Yeah, no, I follow the processes. I appreciate the explanation.
Okay, thanks. Definitely important topic. Cynthia, you had a question on PowerPoint slide number 11.
Right. When I initially looked at this yesterday and this morning, I was thinking that the cost sensitivities on transmission were outside of the main or the core model runs, but then I think I just heard you say that you're including the 400 kW transmission cost in the runs.
Yes, that's correct, Cynthia. We have to have an assumption on what the transmission network upgrade costs would be. So in the base case, we have 400, and then the alternative case is 600. There's no case where there's no transmission network upgrade costs. Now, I would just caveat that and say there are some exceptions to the rule. There's a certain amount of megawatts that we do include that do not incur any transmission network upgrade costs. For example, as we retire gas steam generation, we allow new solar generation that does not incur transmission network upgrade costs. So that would follow this dashed line. But for the majority of new renewable generation, it would incur the $400. Now, sorry, just one other assumption here. We do not include any transmission network upgrades at all for battery energy storage. We assume that these batteries will be co-located either a wind generator or a solar generator in the future, and therefore the wind or the solar is essentially incurring the transmission costs that would be shared across those batteries.
Okay, and to this slide, or what you just said, that your assumptions on batteries that it is co-located, even though it doesn't look like that on the slide.
That's correct, yeah. And I apologize. I thought I caught all of these. I missed one where it said standalone. I'm gonna.
Okay.
Everyone can see me deleting it on the spot. It should really just be batteries. That's confusing. Just to be clear, the assumptions that we're using are what NREL consider to be standalone batteries. But our assumption is they will be co-located with other generations. So they do not incur transmission network upgrades.
Okay, and
just
did
a,
you
oh,
model
sorry.
any revenue sales from, say, exports, or do you model any imports over the expanded transmission, or is that not a factor? Are these very dedicated lines?
Cynthia, could I ask you to just maybe rephrase that question? Sorry.
Oh, when you expand transmission, it often gives you additional opportunities in the regional market. And so are you able to capture that?
Not at this point. When we come to do the, the future RFP analysis, that's something we can look at. But
Okay.
with these resources kind of being generic, we really don't know what that transmission build out is going to be. So no, at the moment, the import and export capability within SPS to the FPP is constant.
Okay, thank you.
So just to follow up on that real quickly. So when you model the transmission costs that are included in your projected cost assumptions, you're looking at mainly the interconnection of the facilities to the grid, not necessarily the build out of the grid to support the additional facilities. Is that true, or are you modeling it both?
No, that's both of them. So these cost assumptions here, this $400, for example, it's not just the interconnection. So it's not just getting the energy to the grid. It's then doing any network upgrades that the SPP identify are required as part of their DICE phase. So this $400 is interconnection and transmission upgrades.
So you're just using it as a placeholder to reflect what the interconnection, what the upgrade cost would be, as well as interconnection costs. But what might actually happen could very well be a lot different, depending on circumstances.
Yes, and to be very clear, they would have the potential to be pretty different. That's why I keep going back to the fact that all of these are generic cost assumptions. What we really need to see is the future RFP. Those bids that come into an RFP will have to include their transmission network upgrade costs. So we may get wind generation with $100, we may get wind generation with $800. Those numbers will be firmed up as part of the RFP.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. James Hall, you had a question somewhat.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Jay. Good afternoon, Ben. So yeah, my question is really on how the IRP process relates to the 2024 RFP. Because I heard, Ben, you mentioned as you went through the slides that you thought maybe some of the LCOE estimates for wind and solar might be on the low side when you were showing the model. And then I think about a model kicking out a seriatim of solutions that are prioritized in part by cost, right, as well as reliability. And then that drives the RFP. But if those costs are turn out when you get the actual numbers to be low, and that would have changed with real world numbers, the seriatim that's produced, I guess my question is the RFP technology agnostic, and then you just use the IRP output to sort of help you frame the size of the capacity need and generally the mix? I mean, how do you account for the fact that the model may be dramatically different to the actual real world costs is my question.
Yeah, so James, great question. What I would go back with just to kind of first address uncertainty in modeling. So when we talk about uncertainty in modeling, that's why it's critical that we kind of do these assumptions. So where we model a range of transmission network upgrades, we model a range of load forecasts and maybe a range of market energy price forecasts. And what I'm going to present later, and I don't really want to skip too far ahead, but I will just give you kind of a sneak peek, is when we start looking at the modeling results, it starts kind of telling you how much wind, solar, storage, firm peaking generation that you're going to need. To me, what these really doing is they're setting out the table stakes for that future RFP. And I'm going to go right down to the last slide. And again, I will come back to this, I promise. Is we're starting to look at under each of these different scenarios that we're going to model. This is the amount of megawatts each scenario would add. As we build out these scenarios, we're going to have larger and larger bookends, James, right? So we're going to have the most conservative estimates and we're going to have the most aggressive estimates. That's really going to be used to scope an RFP, just to give bidders kind of a statement of need, kind of a guess of how many resources we're going to need. And then when we come to do the actual RFP and we get the results, let's just say, and I'm going to pick on one scenario, this first scenario, we've identified 3,200 megawatts of wind and 1,000 megawatts of solar. What you may actually see when you see the RFP results, this may flip. You may end up with 3,000 megawatts of solar and 1,000 megawatts of wind. So really, we're trying to keep the modeling broad enough where we can get the best deal for our customers. So in other words, we're not trying to say we will build 1,000 megawatts of solar because that's what the modeling shows. We're just trying to identify the technical characteristics of the resources that are needed, and then saying, okay, let's issue an RFP and let's make sure we can get the best pricing possible to meet those technical characteristics.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, that's very helpful and good to hear. Thank you for the clarification, Ben.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Scrolling back up. Cynthia, you had the next question on slide 12 about long duration battery costs.
Right. You've got the cost trending equal over time between the three technologies. And I just wondered whether this was the way the NREL data presented it or forecasted it. And do you see a possibility or a sensitivity to say have the longer duration battery cost curve start to merge lower with, say, 4-hour battery, over time, or what?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember these are presented in nominal dollars. So I think NREL's data do show in real dollars the cost of batteries declining over time. These are just obviously kind of flat when you add in inflation. But to your point, these numbers do stay pretty constant, the difference between the 4, 6, and 8. Do you start seeing these numbers converge potentially? I'm a little bit reluctant, Cynthia, to start making changes to kind of one NREL assumption and saying, oh, well, maybe we see 8-hour batteries declining, because I think there's still, there could be some questions on whether solar or wind generation really is going to get down to $5, excluding network transmission network upgrades. So I don't want to start cherry picking the data. I think, my recommendation would be use the data as presented. However, and again, just clarifying what I just said to James, when we come to issue the RFP next year, these numbers will be replaced with real market data. So if we're seeing 6-hour batteries, are a little bit closer to 4-hour batteries, we will absolutely capture that when we start looking at the RFP analysis.
Okay, and you did say this was the NREL data.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Cynthia, you had another question on co-locating storage. I think Ben answered that. Is that correct?
I think so. Didn't you say that you were assuming co-location? I think it's on the slide 13.
Yes. Yeah, we're assuming here that all of these batteries would incur zero transmission network upgrade costs, which essentially implies, or it means they have to be co-located either at an existing wind or solar facility. The one exception would be if they were generator replacement. So if we saw, say, Toke retiring, you could put some batteries at a retiring site. But for the most part, we include these as co-located.
Can you go to your next slide, 13? So this was the slide I wondered about. Would the ELCCs for wind and solar, do they improve it under an assumption of co-location, or is this just the way we look at the data at this point, look at the ELCCs between these technologies?
Okay, so there may be two answers to that question, Cynthia, so bear with me. The way the SPP do accredited capacity for ELCC is what they call the sum of the parts methodology. So the wind accreditation as a standalone percentage is not impacted by being co-located with a battery. So in other words, the wind accreditation neither increases or declines if it's co-located with a battery. Likewise, the battery accreditation for 4 hours is not impacted by the wind accreditation. It doesn't increase or decrease. The way SPP approached this problem is, as I said, the sum of the parts. So you just add those two accreditations together on a megawatt basis, not on a percentage basis. And that would be the total accreditation a wind and battery facility got. So let me give you kind of an example there. Is we talked earlier about a fictional wind project, right? That was 100 megawatts. That wind project would have received about 15% accreditation, so 15 megawatts. Let's just say, for fun, the battery got 85% accreditation. And it was a 50 megawatt or 100 megawatt battery, excuse me, a 100 megawatt wind farm. You would take the 85 megawatts from the solar accreditation, and you would take the 15 megawatts from the wind accreditation, and you would simply add them together. So that combined battery and wind facility, using that example, would essentially get 100% accreditation.
Okay.
Now, if those two values exceeded the transmission capability, so now let's say that battery got 90 megawatts of accreditation and the wind got 15, you add them together and it's 105 megawatts. If you were limited at the transmission point of injection to 100 megawatts, then you would cap those two added together at 100 megawatts.
Okay, you know what, and Ben, you explained this to me when we were in Roswell. And so thanks for refreshing me on that.
Absolutely.
Hopefully it was helpful to others.
Yeah, Athena, you had a
I
similar
do want to,
question.
I do. And I'm not talking about at the start at 2028. I'm kind of looking at the sloping down for this solar and wondering where that came from. I understand that as you add more solar, that maybe it's ELCC values going down because you can't necessarily use it all. And so if that's the case, then wouldn't it be affected by, wouldn't that be offset by the use of batteries such that it would maintain an ELCC value? Or maybe I just missed what that ELCC value was from, the declining part for the solar.
So Athena, I think the answer to your question is yes. So let me just explain it. Is the solar accreditation on a standalone basis? So if you just put solar generation and there was no battery on that site, you would see the accreditation of the solar facility decline over time. So then if we go back to the assumption I was just explaining to Cynthia, where we assume our batteries are going to be co-located at wind or solar facilities, the big advantage of doing that is you're putting a battery with its own accreditation at a solar facility, and you're adding those two together. So even as the solar curve declines with the LCC over time, you're still getting your accreditation from the battery. So what you actually see when you start adding solar and batteries together is you're really right at around that 100% accreditation for those sites.
Okay. So then, the battery by itself is accredited as 100% and then slightly declining. But
correct.
Okay. Okay. And then the solar is just assuming solar, that there's really no battery, but you'd have to go back and take a look at them together.
Absolutely, that's correct, yeah.
Ben, can you maybe clarify why, if you build a standalone solar project, why would the accredited capacity go down over time? I mean, what's underlying this curve here? I think I understand, but I want to confirm it, but I just want to.
Yeah. So the basis of an effective load carrying capability study is a loss of load expectation. So when you're planning a reliable electric system, essentially what you're doing is you're planning to essentially lose load 1 day in 10 years or 0.1 day a year. So you have that metric, that's your starting point. And you're saying, okay, I need to solve a reliability system or a system with a reliability of 0.1 day per year. As you rely more heavily on solar generation with no batteries, just standalone solar generation, you have more generation that is meeting your peak. right? So it's meeting that 5 p.m., 6 p.m. in July and August that I explained earlier. But if you just add solar generation to the system, what you're finding is your net peak. So your peak demand net of the solar generation is shifting later and later in the evening. So now maybe my peak is no longer 5 p.m., maybe it's 8 p.m. So as you see the penetration of solar resources increase over the entire SPP footprint, in order to maintain that metric of 0.1 day in a year, what you need to do is you need to start solving generation for later in the day. And that's why you see this decline in value that solar generation is providing. So when there's few megawatts of solar generation on the system, it's really closely aligned to the peak. As you rely more heavily on solar generation, you're shifting that net peak to hours in which solar generation is not so productive. Now, keep in mind, this is an average value. This is not an incremental value of solar. If you were doing an incremental EOCC value, what you would actually see is the first X amount of megawatts would receive almost 100% accreditation or high accreditation. And then as you add more megawatts of solar, the actual value of those incremental megawatts is becoming closer to zero. What we actually see here is an average impact. I'm not sure if I explained that. It's kind of a hard concept, Jake. So let me
let me try and cap. So the line's going down here because utilities throughout SPP are continuing to add solar, and it's generating. You know, if it's only solar, it's discharging energy at the same time, and your net peak changes to a different time of day, and that's why the addition of batteries help.
It shifts the hour in which you are likely to lose load.
Yeah. Understood.
So as much solar generation you can add, you're less likely to lose load at 5, 6 p.m. Fantastic. But now 9 p.m. becomes your loss of load expectation hour.
Athena, does that help?
Well, then that brings up, how come it levels out after 2039?
So here?
Yeah.
So what we've got here is there becomes a point where your average number becomes, the marginal impact actually brings down your average number. So what you would actually see is an inverse of this curve. No, excuse me, let me reframe this. It's kind of a hard concept. What you would actually see is the incremental value of solar once you reach a certain saturation point actually has no added benefit whatsoever. In other words, if the SPP system peak is 55,000 megawatts, once you add, say, 60,000 megawatts of solar to the system without any batteries at all, then the incremental benefit, the marginal benefit of solar is zero. It's not helping you out at all. So in order to kind of not show a cliff edge here, which would kind of skew the results, what we actually do is when we hit that inflection point, is we just level off the results and just say, hey, the average would essentially stay constant. And it's so far out in the tail end of the model, it really doesn't impact anything. If we were seeing this inflection point earlier, then we would know that that's probably a point in which solar on its own no longer benefits the reliability of the SPP system.
How about if we have more questions on this, we can try and pick them up over time. I want to make sure we get through the whole set of questions.
Okay, I'm all right for now.
Okay. Athena, you did have the next question on, was there any carbon pricing included in the cost of natural gas assumptions on slide 16, Ben?
So on slide 16, let me just get there. 15? Did you say 15 or 16?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm just reading off the slide. It was, Athena wanted, well, which slide you're referring to? She said
It would
16.
be, it'd be 15 or 16,
Yeah.
both of them.
Okay. Yeah, I know for a fact there's no embedded carbon assumptions on slide 15. I do not believe, I'm 99% certain there's no embedded carbon cost assumptions within this market energy price forecast.
Are you going to include some in any further modeling?
Not at the moment. We haven't got a social cost of carbon scenario that we presented up here. And then we didn't get any stakeholder requests to include a social cost of carbon either.
Just
Oh,
to be clear,
boo. Sorry.
well, there was, I mean, to be clear, there is a request on accelerated carbon decarbonization. So not the same as a higher carbon price, but the topic has not been neglected. But
Correct, and they both essentially have the same result. If you accelerate decarbonisation, it essentially has the same result, is including a social cost of carbon. It's just a different approach to doing that.
Okay.
Jeffrey Pollock, you had a question on the on-peak. If you want to go with your question on, sorry, on slide 16. Yeah.
I was just noticing the decline after 2026 of the on-peak prices, and that it didn't seem like the off-peak prices were declining as much. Do you have any commentary in terms of what's driving the decline in the on-peak prices, and then why off-peak was not declining as much, or appears not to be declining as much?
Yeah, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a get out of jail free card here and say these projections were produced by third parties. So I don't have the exact information of why we would see kind of a declining cost for on-peak and a static one for off-peak. Jeff, if I had to speculate, what my assumption would be is in the on-peak, you're starting to see a lot more solar generation being included. For example, there's not much solar generation within SPP today. Until recently, there was 192 megawatts SPP wide. As you see that solar generation coming up, I think you're going to see that decrease market energy prices for on-peak. I think when you start looking at off-peak, we're already pretty saturated on wind within SPP. We're already at 33,000 megawatts. So I suspect you see less of an impact as you add more wind generation to the off-peak hours. That'd be what I would speculate, Jeff, but again, those aren't necessarily our numbers.
Yeah, it'd be probably helpful to have a commentary on that, just so you understand kind of the assumptions and thoughts going into it.
Okay. I think we can do that.
I think we have a couple quick questions. Athena, you had follow up on questions. SPS able to take advantage of tax credits? Follow up, does it get a guaranteed rate of return on capital assets? Ben, you want to start with the first one?
Was the first one, Jay, do SPS assume tax credits? Did I hear that correctly?
All right. Well, Athena, I mean, I think if I understand the
Yeah,
question.
I'm thinking the advancement tax credits, and it's my understanding that utility companies can't take advantage of that.
No, so when we look at our modeling assumptions, right here, these modeling assumptions, the reason this wind and this solar is relatively low cost is because it is assuming federal tax credits. So you are assuming production tax credits for both wind and for solar generation, and for battery energy storage, you're including investment tax credits. So in our modeling, we do assume PTCs and ITCs, which I believe is the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, can utilities take advantage of tax credits? Athena, without knowing exactly what you're referring to, there were some hurdles prior to the Inflation Reduction Act. There were some hurdles in how utilities could take advantage of solar investment tax credits. There was some hurdles what happens when utilities no longer had an appetite, for tax credits. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in August of last year did address several of those concerns that utilities had. So now for solar generation, we include a production tax credit, which was a hurdle in the past. For tax appetite, there's a transferability clause or option for utilities. So I don't know if I addressed your question, but essentially there's
You
not
did.
any tax hurdles. Okay.
Thank you.
And then the second question I thought I heard was, do utilities have a guaranteed rate of return? Was that correct?
Correct, for the utility company. For capital assets.
So the answer to that is no, but if someone wants to suggest that, we would absolutely take that.
I don't know, Zoe, Brooke, you want to touch on that quickly?
Sure, this is Brooke. No, we don't have a guaranteed rate of return for utility investment. the commission authorizes a return on equity and an improved weighted average cost of capital. But by no means is that guaranteed. So the authorized rate of return is established in utility base rate cases, but actual earned returns of utilities can vary based on a number of factors. It's an opportunity to earn when the commission establishes a weighted average cost of capital in the rate case, but it is not a guarantee.
Maybe guaranteed wasn't the right term, but thank you for explaining it.
Yeah, the subtlety, it's authorized and an opportunity. I think if we need more follow-up on that, maybe we can take it another time. But I think to tie it back to the question, Ben, it's that those are the values that are used in assuming the cost of a self-build project, right? Those, the commission authorized weighted average cost of capital.
Yeah, so just to be clear, Jay, for the purposes of the IRP, we are using NREL's data that has their own kind of embedded cost recovery assumptions. When we come to do the RFP, to Jeff Pollock's point earlier, when we do a revenue requirement analysis, we will use our weighted average cost of capital. And it's actually weighted between Texas and New Mexico.
Okay. We got another quick question that was added, but one that came in over the phone from Mark Dubois from Los Alamos. What is the assumption on battery life?
So that's a good question that I'm paused on, because NREL data, I believe, is 15 years. They assume batteries will last 15 years. In our most recent RFP, we were actually seeing bids come in for 20-year life. So I'm just going to pause real quickly, see if there's anyone on my team, Shireen, Sonia, Jake. What assumptions did we have for the model we're presenting today? Was it 15 years or 20 years? Do you know?
For the battery,
Yes, please.
it is 15 years.
15? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that clarifies that it was 15 years. And then Eric, you have the final word here. Question says it appears that renewable ELCCs are significantly lower presented in SPP's November 2022 report.
Yeah, hi, this is Eric from NM Rita, and I just noticed that I just went out and looked and saw that SPP, when they set their ELCCs, they did a report that they say should be the policy effective 6/1/23, and it looks like the graphics in that document are kind of significantly different than the renewable graphics here. So I would just like you to true that up if you could, if those guys are the people setting the rules for you.
Yeah, so I would need to see the data you're looking at, because the numbers that were presented today should match. Maybe the question I'd have is, again, without being able to see what you're looking at, are you looking at the ELCC assigned as of today, so 2023, or are you looking at those forward-looking projections that they create?
I believe I put the link in the chat, so when you're not screen sharing, you can see that. Perhaps you could look at that.
Yeah, I'll take a look when we have a break and try and rectify the difference you're seeing.
Great, thanks.
Okay, but just to be clear, Ben, your understanding, I mean, the numbers you've assumed here is your understanding of the current effective values for SPP.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
yeah.
And then we can double check on your point, Eric. So
yeah, look at figure 6. Figure 6, I think, might be seasonal. There are a bunch of different seasons, different times. So, but it looks consistently different. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's going to conclude the first section here. I'd like to propose we take a 10-minute break, roughly 10 minutes, and start at the top of the hour with the second portion of the presentation.
Jay, we had one quick question from Jim from the Mexico State Land Office in the chat that we didn't, maybe we could address that quickly before we break.
Sorry, I
Jim,
missed that. Where
from the State Land Office asked if the transmission costs included fees and right-of-way costs. Is that right, Jim? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you. You were talking about the the transmission upgrade costs. And you were talking about it on a per megawatt, in dollar per megawatt. And I was just curious if that included, just upgrades to existing infrastructure, or if it was also to acquire fee land or to acquire rights of way.
So my initial thought, and we can clarify this during the break also, is it should be all inclusive for the simple reason as those are the costs that we use within our analyses. But let me just take that question on break and we'll just make that confirmation if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Margie. We want to take a breather here, give Ben a little rest, and then let's see, pick up at the top of the hour.
This meeting is being recorded.
So Jay, if you don't mind, I just wanted to clarify, there was a couple of questions that I said I'd get back to people on. So in reverse order, the last question was essentially are site and land rights included within those transmission network upgrade costs? And I think we can say with a pretty fair level of confidence that they are. So what actually happens is the Southwest Power Pool put together estimates for the new transmission build out, and we are pretty confident those transmission estimates are fully inclusive and would include, a line item for site and land rights. Can't say with 100% certainty because I don't have their estimates in front of me, but we're pretty confident, and we can certainly circle back and let you know if that is incorrect. And then, can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And then this SPP study, so this was sent in the chat. So this is the 2022 ELCC Wind and Solar Study report that comes from the Southwest Power Pool. And please correct me if I'm wrong, I was referred to figure 6. Get there real quickly. Figure 6. Figure 6. Okay. So what are we looking at here? What we're looking at here is historical weather years. So when the SPP pulled together their ELCC studies, obviously wind, solar is obviously very weather dependent. So they're actually looking at 10 years of historical weather years for wind accreditation. And then the dotted line is the average that they're falling upon. But this is based on how much wind is on the system today. So the actual graph you want to be referring to is up slightly higher. Is this graph. So this graph here shows you the summer value for wind and then the winter value for wind. Now, what's kind of important to understand is the horizontal axis here does not have years. I have begged SPP to make this horizontal axis years and aren't currently there. But what we need to do is we need to first establish how much wind is going to be on the SPP system in a certain year in order to give it a value. So the way we do that is we calculate how much wind and solar SPP are projecting in their ITPs, their transmission plans. We take how much wind or solar is going to be on the system according to their ITPs in certain years. And we then use that data to generate what we expect the ELCC curves to be. Now, I don't expect people to follow along with that. That's extremely complicated to show. If there's a desire, I can show at our next meeting how we convert these ELCC studies from SPP to give us a year on the horizontal axis. I just wanted to confirm that we are using this 2022 study for wind. I will say we are not using it for solar generation. One of the important things to know if you read through this study is they did not give forward-looking curves for solar generation within this report. It did not do these forward-looking projections. So I think we're using SPP's 2020 study for solar generation, which is the most recent. I could literally spend 2 hours talking about this study, so I'll pause there. Jay, I wasn't sure the gentleman who asked that question, so I addressed it. Was there a follow-up?
Yeah, that was Eric. He said, understood, he thanked you. I've only one other question. You talked about the solar and wind. How about the storage? Where did the storage accreditation come from?
Yep, so the storage is yet another study from SPP. So if you go to SPP's website and just do a Google search on ELCC, you will see a 2020 solar study, a 2022 solar and wind study, and I believe it's a 2023 energy storage resource study. So unfortunately, 3 different places, but we are being consistent in our approach and using the most recent study for each of those resources.
Thanks, Ben. You know, you sacrificed by not having tea during the break, but your team's done a good job trying to jump on and answer these questions right away. So thanks for that. Hopefully, it sounds like Eric was okay responding to his question. So maybe we can move on if you're ready.
Okay, sure. And then there was just one clarification to make, you know, just as we're kind of thinking about the answers I've previously provided. I think it was Athena asked about the tax credits and whether as a utility we could take advantage of those tax credits. And just wanted to kind of remind people of when we get tax credits or when a resource qualifies for tax credits, what it essentially does is it drives down the cost of that resource. And that lowered cost is then what we modeled, which is essentially passed on to customers. So it's not like there's this tax benefit for XL Energy, it's the tax benefit reduces the cost of solar wind, which is then what obviously we acquire and we pay for. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity there, Athena. Okay, are we ready to get into the modeling results?
Athena asked one more, another question popped up, and I think maybe if we can, Athena, I think
just a statement, it's just a statement. I think with your graphs, you might consider having solar plus storage and wind plus storage ELCC lines.
I think well, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong. It's some better way of explaining what the sum of the parts means and how that's the methodology for combining the two, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we can.
Can we put that as homework?
Yeah.
Okay. Athena, is that okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, I do want to just add one clarification to the sum of the parts as well, because it is complicated, Jay, you're right. When we start looking at solar plus storage, you need to make an assumption on how big that storage device is going to be in relation to the solar facility. So let's say you put in a 500 megawatt solar facility. What size battery do you then put in at that same site? What we're seeing right now, just kind of broadly speaking, is the batteries usually sized about 50% of the solar resource. So you put in a 500 megawatt solar facility, it gets the 60% accreditation of 500 megawatts. And then you put in, say, a 250 megawatt battery, and that 250 megawatt battery gets around, 97% right now. So you would add those two together and that would be your accreditation. So it is dependent upon the size of the battery. For demonstration purposes, I will present that data, assuming the battery is 50% the size of the solar or the wind farm, but obviously that is an assumption we would have to make.
Yeah, we deal with this a lot here in Hawaii. I mean, you're talking about DC ratings versus AC versus the inverter size, the battery size. So I think I put the caveat. I think we can try and come up with a better way of explaining how the hybrid resources are handled. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Well, and I think as long as it's consistent and we get to see both graphs on the same chart without battery, solar without battery, and solar with battery.
Sure, absolutely, we can do that.
All right, ready to jump into the modeling, Ben?
Okay, let's get to the fun stuff. So I'm going to just skip ahead one slide just real quickly. And I'm going to present kind of again the list of the scenarios just so everyone can see the hierarchy. And in this case, the first one we're going to present right now is the multi-jurisdictional baseline. Again, just so everyone's clear, as I mentioned earlier, we're using the financial forecast, we're using the base gas, and then the $400 transmission network upgrade cost. So again, let's first of all start about why we're doing a multi-jurisdictional baseline. So the IRP rules require us to discuss how we're going to do our resource planning in other states. So at the moment, you know, everything we've talked about is system-wide. So our capacity needs system-wide. That's how we do our resource planning. But we got to recall that SPS is a multi-jurisdictional utility. So we're not just New Mexico, we're New Mexico, Texas. And currently we have some wholesale load that, as I mentioned, is dropping off in the mid-20s. So our intention here is to do modeling that does not incorporate any jurisdictional specific requirements. So in this case, we're going to do modeling that does not take into account New Mexico's RPS case. Now, the only reason we're doing this, it's not part of the IRP per se, it's not a New Mexico scenario, it's to inform our other jurisdictions of what the modeling would look like if we didn't incorporate New Mexico rules. So this is more of an informational purposes only. So as we look at this, and I'm going to talk about the kind of the resource assumptions earlier, just keep in mind, as we've mentioned previously, this is really kind of somewhat outside of the IRP scope because this does not necessarily conform with the RPS scope. What we're actually going to find out is it inadvertently it does, but it's not required to. So again, this table is just one I presented earlier. I'm just repeating it just in case I need to go back through slides so it's not near the top of the presentation. This shows our system-wide capacity need under the financial forecast, the most conservative forecast. And as I talked about earlier, we've issued an RFP in November 2022, filed CCNs recently. We will resolve kind of this capacity need in green, but we're still going to have a significant capacity need in the later part of the decade, even with the new resources we're asking for in the CCN. So what we do here is we, first of all, we allow Encompass to select one of 5 resource types, excuse me. We allow Encompass to select any one of 5 resource types. So it can go in and it can select combined cycle generation, gas generation, CC, 2-on-1. It can select a combustion turbine generator that does not include a hydrogen conversion, so just gas generation. We allow the model to select 4, 6, or 8-hour lithium-ion batteries, wind generation, or solar generation. So it can pick any of those 5 resources. Again, we talked about this in prior meetings. It's going to have to resolve this capacity need. We have to solve the capacity need. The way the model is actually going to solve is it's going to provide the lowest cost portfolio to resources to our customers. So it may overbuild on, say, wind generation, even if it's overbuilding on capacity, if that lowers the overall system cost. So now as we look at the results of the first scenario. So again, just keep in mind, this does include new gas generation, CTs being referred to as firm peaking generation here. Before we talk about the new results, just to provide some context, right now, SPS has around about 7,500 megawatts of nameplate generation, not accredited nameplate generation. That includes 2,400-ish megawatts of wind generation. It includes 192 megawatts of solar generation as we stand today, and the rest is a combination of coal and natural gas. What we see in this first chart on the left-hand side here is annual resource additions by year through 2042. Firm peaking being the green line here, being CTs. Essentially, it's pretty consistent. CTs are pretty lumpy. You're adding in 233 megawatts per CT. So 2 CTs, 2 CTs, 2 CTs, 1 CT. You see in the yellow is the new solar additions that's being added on a nameplate basis, again, not accredited. And then you also see the wind generation that's being added to the system. Now, one of the things I'd like to point out, what I mentioned earlier, is how this is dependent upon what comes in the RFP. Part of the reason this wind is being front-loaded, this wind's coming online early, is because the cost assumptions that we've made in the modeling. If we're modeling, sorry to jump around on you guys, but if we're modeling relatively low cost wind, that's below the system average energy cost, it's going to say, let's build that wind sooner. It's going to provide energy savings. Why wait? If when we issued the RFP, if the winds came back, and let's just use an extreme example of $50, then you're probably going to see either the wind being pushed into later years or less wind being added at the expense for a different resource, potentially say solar. On the table at the bottom, you're going to see our total nameplate on the fleet. So like I said, right now we have 7,500 megawatts of nameplate generation. By 2028, net of retirements, you're going to see we're going to have close to 8,800 megawatts of generation. And that's going to increase year on year. So as you can see, we're stepping up through 12,000, 13,000, 14,500 megawatts of nameplate generation. What I think is really interesting, if we take nothing away from else from these graphs, is this chart on the right-hand side. What you see is our summer peak on the black line here. Now, this does not include the planning reserve margin. This is just purely our summer peak. And then what we see in this kind of this green hashed line here is our existing dispatchable generation. And if you recall earlier, I mentioned dispatchable generation currently is gas generation. So it's in co-generation. It's co, CT, CC, gas steam. What we see in this dark solid green is the addition of new CT generation, new peaking generation. The reason I find this interesting is because this line is very, very flat and it really follows our summer peak pretty consistently. In other words, what it's saying, in order to maintain system reliability, we are going to add pretty much a one-for-one relationship. As gas comes off the system, new gas comes on the system. What we then see here is our existing renewable generation, which is going to decline over time as some of these PPAs expire. And then we have the new renewable generation coming online, blue being wind, yellow being solar. Again, this is nameplate. So what we start seeing is, even though we still have a reliable system based on gas generation, is the economics of renewables is really providing energy. Talk about that a bit more in a few more slides. So let's look now at accredited capacity. I think you kind of see this relationship more on this graph. What we see here is our last of our co-generation falling off the system, our CCs, gas steam, existing firm peaking units, with new firm peaking units. Again, as I just mentioned, our gas generation from the accredited capacity stays pretty constant, just below the summer load requirement. So really what we see is enough gas generation to meet kind of our winter peak. And then you top this up with generation from solar, from accredited capacity from wind, and then a relatively small amount in this scenario of storage. So as you look at our accredited capacity mixes in 2030, 2040, under this scenario, you see kind of gas generation in 2030, solar and wind with a little bit of storage. And then over time, that mix from an accredited capacity perspective doesn't change greatly. But what we're more concerned about when we start talking about decarbonisation and when we start talking about complying with RPS goals isn't necessarily a capacity mix, it's an energy mix. So now this shows a very different story. Is we have a fairly consistent amount of gas on the system, but when you start looking at the energy that the gas generation is producing, it declines over time. In other words, you still have the same amount of megawatts on the system, but its capacity factor, its megawatt hours, is lower over time. Then what's really replacing that is solar generation and wind generation coming on. So here's our energy mix under this story. This is how much energy we need. So this dark blue line or black line here refers to our energy sales requirement that I demonstrated earlier. You're mixing up in 2040, 64% of our energy sales is coming from wind generation. 22% is coming from solar generation. So in this case, again, I want to just reiterate, this is not the New Mexico RPS case. This is a multi-jurisdictional baseline to inform our other jurisdictions of, even if you didn't take into account RPS goals, you let economics just dictate the resource portfolio, you're still seeing a huge build out of renewable generation. In fact, even if you do not force the model to meet the New Mexico RPS requirements, we actually exceed the RPS requirements. So in 2030, we would have 76% renewable generation, including a little bit with battery storage, and that would actually increase to 87% in 2040. New Mexico's RPS goals that, again, are not forced into this model of 50% and 80% enriched respectively. So if we look at the key takeaways, from this this informative modeling run. First of all, I want to set the scene. We're setting the bookend here. This is the low bookend. This is us saying, okay, we're using our most conservative load forecast. We're assuming the planning reserve margin stays at 15%, and we're using our base gas assumption. So this really is setting, like I said, that lower bookend on how many new resources the model's picking between now and 2040. So again, just to reiterate, we go back to that loads and resources table. We have a 2,300 megawatt capacity need in 2030. That increases to 4,800 megawatts in 2040. Our recently filed CCN is still about 600 megawatts of that capacity need. So you need to still resolve the remaining capacity need. It encompasses adding by 2030, 120 megawatts of storage, 3,200 megawatts of wind, 1,000 megawatts of solar, and 900 megawatts of gas. By 2040, those numbers increase. For storage, they actually stay the same. But for wind, they increase to 4,300 megawatts, for solar, 2,800 megawatts, and for gas generation, 3,700 megawatts. So again, just want to just draw a couple of comparisons here. The dynamic between wind and solar could definitely change pretty dramatically when we see the results of the RFP. This is really showing wind generation being more economical than solar. So that pricing changes pretty small amount. We could see these numbers shift. And we're going to talk a moment about gas versus storage. That's on the next couple of slides. Even under this pretty conservative case, we end up, like I said, with 76% renewable in 2030, 87% renewable generation in 2040. So keep in mind, we're talking the difference between energy and capacity. So to James Hall's question earlier, how does this inform the RFP? This to me would be the low bookend for the 2024 RFP. When we issue the RFP, we would say, hey, our modeling has identified 1,000 megawatts of dispatchable resource need. That could be combined between storage and gas at the moment. So we would wait to see how that actually played out in an RFP. And then also 4,200 megawatts of renewable energy, variable energy resources. Again, those numbers could shift depending on what you've seen in an RFP. The other thing that I would like to add is this is kind of the initial Encompass runs. What we will actually do is we would go back and do some reliability modeling and make sure when we look at this on a more granular level that this kind of resource mix, even though it's meeting the planning reserve margin requirement, isn't creating any expected unserved energy. So we need to make sure we're energy adequate as opposed to just resource adequacy adequate. Now I'm going to shift down this modeling, and now we're going to present kind of our first scenario that's kind of within the IRP scope. So this now would be meeting the New Mexico Energy Transition Act based on only currently commercially available technologies as they stand today. So this would essentially say there's no gas generation being added to the portfolio at all. What we're adding is wind, solar, 4, 6, and 8 hour batteries. Now, I want to make it clear when we say existing technology, as James pointed out in the last meeting, that's kind of a little bit of a loose term. What we're talking about is existing commercially available technology. So we're really concentrating on, if we issued an RFP next year, which resources would we like to see that were economic? And that's wind, solar, and batteries. So now again, as we look at this table, same table as before, 2,300 megawatt capacity need by 2030. And now we go to our nameplate additions. And of course, as you can see here, no new gas generation being added to the system. What we see here is essentially a lot of that gas generation is being replaced with storage. We have similar quantities of wind, albeit maybe a little bit spread out, and then similar quantities of solar. I think what's the important thing to know here is when you start replacing retiring gas generation with limited duration storage, is you're going to need to build more of it. So if we go back, I'm going to flip around slides real quickly. In this case, where we allow new gas, we end up with a portfolio of about 15,000 megawatts nameplate generation. When we do not allow new gas generation, we end up with approximately 20,000 megawatts of generation. So really what we're saying is it's not a one-for-one relationship. As you retire a megawatt of gas generation, you need to be putting more than a megawatt of duration or storage duration onto the system. So now kind of that relationship is starting to go a little bit out the window here. If we now see our peak demand and we see our plan and reserve margin on these two lines, as our gas steam generation falls off the system, we end up adding more storage to the system in excess of our plan and reserve margin on a nameplate basis. And that's to maintain system reliability. We also see a lot of additional renewable generation. Now, just before I go on to this next slide, I am in the middle of a pretty bad thunderstorm. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the audio okay, Margie?
Yep, you're still good, and I can hear your little four-legged friend, but it's not overwhelming, so you're good.
Okay, well I can, let me know if I need to go into another room. I'm in an open plan office at the moment. So now if we look at the accredited capacity, again, this kind of is a highlight of this part of the graph, is we start looking at, okay, we have our gas generation falling off the system, and then we have a very large build out of 4-hour, for the most part, batteries. And the reason that is, as I was just explaining, is you're going to need more batteries to maintain system reliability than you would if you were replacing it with a non-limited duration technology. The big difference here is when we start looking at accredited capacity from the previous example. So what you see here now is kind of our gas portfolio over time as these gas generators retire is increasingly replaced with limited duration 4-hour battery energy storage. And you have this still, even though you've added a lot of energy to the system for wind and solar, it's still not the predominant capacity resource. So now as we flip to the energy graph, I'd say I just got a text message that's getting a little bit noisy. I'm just going to please accept my apologies. I'm just going to come off video. And I'm just going to step away. Can everyone still hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, and then hopefully my video was turned off. Get me sat in a dark room. Then let's get back to the presentation. Okay, so now let's look at the energy requirements. Again, very similar to the graph earlier, is we start seeing our new gas our existing gas generation, the energy is really falling completely off the system here. So you're really getting very limited energy from gas resources. or you've got less as kind of our existing CTs that retire in the 2040s to 2050s. And what you really see is a huge build out of solar, wind, and then kind of some storage coming in here. So I think this was the point I was trying to make to Cynthia earlier, is when you look at seeing gas generation come onto the system, we're really tracking our energy requirement pretty closely. So we're really producing a little bit more energy than needed for the system that we're then selling into the SPP market. When you start relying more heavily on batteries, as I was explaining earlier, this line here doesn't include the load to charge those batteries. So you've really got to start overproducing energy to charge the batteries, and then these batteries are discharged at a different time. Now, there's not 100% round trip efficiency when you're charging and discharging batteries. So if you put in a megawatt hour into a battery, you are not getting a megawatt hour out of the battery. There's about an 85% round trip efficiency there. So now as we look at the key takeaways from this approach, again, just kind of repeating some of the information I've already provided: a 2,300 megawatt capacity need in 2030, 4,800 megawatts in 2040 in our existing RFP, so about 600 megawatts of that. What you now see is kind of 1,380, so 1,400 megawatts of storage coming on the system for 2040, 3,500 megawatts of wind, and then 1,000 megawatts of solar. And what you really see is these numbers becoming pretty extreme as you go out into the next part of the decade. It's 2040, with these numbers being, 6,300 megawatts of storage, 6,800 megawatts of wind, and 2,400 megawatts of solar. So this really would be considered a high bookend. Now, again, when I'm talking bookends, I'm talking within the confines of the financial forecast, the lowest forecast. So we've really set the scene here of, if we were to issue an RFP next year, we would be asking for, excuse me, this is actually an old slide that I'm presenting now. I hope this was actually corrected. We did a correction in the modeling. So this is actually incorrect, as you're seeing on the screen. I was presenting, I'm not presenting to what hopefully is on GridWorks number. This number would actually be 1,380. So as matching this table, we would identify a 1,300 megawatt firm dispatchable need, and then for renewables, about 4,500 megawatts. Then as we go through the modeling, we also did an analysis where we had long duration storage. So essentially the same assumptions as before, where we are only including wind, solar, and batteries, no new gas generation, but now we're including 100-hour battery energy storage. Excel Energy do have a couple of pilot programs for 100-hour batteries, but when we actually did the modeling did not select any long duration batteries. In other words, based on the technical characteristics and the cost assumptions to long duration, it would not be economical compared to existing lithium-ion technologies. What we intend to do, which is this second bullet point here, in our modeling, we will force a long duration battery into the system, the model, so we can evaluate what the incremental cost of such a battery would be. So we can turn around and say, hey, if we were to force in a 200 megawatt, 100-hour battery, that's going to have this impact to customer costs. It wouldn't be the most economical, but it would just provide information to stakeholders. And then the last modeling that I want to touch upon is the increased resource adequacy requirements. So I mentioned earlier, everything we presented today has included a 15% plan and reserve margin requirement, which is the existing SPP PRM requirement effective this summer. In discussions throughout the SPP working groups, we expect that plan and reserve margin is probably going to increase at some point in the future. We don't know what the value is going to be. So in this case, we evaluated an 18% or 18% planning reserve margin in the summer and a 20 planning reserve margin in the winter. So again, this is going to drive the need for new resources. It's going to increase our capacity need, which in turn increases system reliability. So now what we see here is a greater capacity need in these out years, because obviously you're dove into a higher PRM. I haven't presented all of the same slides in the past just because they're pretty similar. So what I wanted to show here was the difference. So what we see in this top table, this was our existing technology case, assuming a 15% planning reserve margin. So the resources that I've already presented. In this red table is the resources that would be added if we increase the PRM to 18% in the summer, 20% in the winter. So what we see here is this is predominantly a capacity need. It's not really an energy need. You're increasing your capacity requirement. The only really strong capacity resource is going to be storage. So what you actually see is the addition of battery energy storage to the portfolio, an extra 450 megawatts. And in turn, just because, again, you've got to charge that batteries, it did give you a slightly more economical approach to adding wind generation to the system. So I'm going to end with these last two slides. The first is kind of what I consider to be probably the scope of a 2024 RFP, which is trying to solve our resource need through the end of this decade. If we look at the portfolios that I've just presented, the modeling results that I've just presented, we start with essentially the multi-jurisdictional baseline. We have a need for 1,500 megawatts of firm peaking generation, so dispatchable generation, whether that's gas or storage, and 4,300 megawatts or 4,251 of variable energy resources, wind and solar. Those numbers do not change a huge amount between now and 2030 based on the scenario. So I would look at this as being kind of a bookend just for the financial forecast of kind of identifying the types of resources, the technical characteristics of resources we need in RFP. And that is a large amount of low cost energy, the renewable energy that you're seeing here. And then also, as we've discussed before in previous meetings, the need for dispatchable generation. And as I've mentioned several times on this meeting, all of these numbers would be highly dependent upon the pricing that we actually saw in the RFP. So we wouldn't just go out and procure 3,230 megawatts of wind, for example. We would see what the pricing came in at, and then obviously that may be more, it may be less, it may be a transition from wind to solar. We would have to see what the actual results of the RFP show. When we look at our resource need through 2040, as we go out further into the future, now we have more of a divergence between the portfolios. So now we start seeing the difference between 3,800 megawatts of dispatchable all the way up to 6,300 megawatts. And then when we look at renewable energy, we're looking at 7,100 megawatts to 9,300 megawatts. I'm not saying this is important, not important. Please don't take what I'm about to say as that. What I'm saying is we will address this need in several future IRPs. Now, we need to keep it in mind today. I am absolutely want to reiterate that point. But really, as we're looking at issuing RFPs, really what we're looking at solving is our need through the end of the decade. And then these numbers will change more as we file future IRPs and as hopefully some of these future technologies, for example, long duration storage, become more economic or they have technical improvements. So I talked for a lot there. I'll pause and throw it open to questions.
Thanks, Ben. Sorry, the questions have slowed down a little bit. So folks, please put into the chat if you have questions. We do have some that have been queued up already. So I wanted to start with one that came in over the break. This was from, again, Mark Bebo from Los Alamos. Ben, it was a question on how, the first question was on the lifetime of the batteries And then he had a follow-up on how are you treating the battery replacement after each 15 years?
Yeah, so when we look at modeling, what we're actually seeing would be the battery retires at the end of the model. So if we look at this table, for example, and we look at a storage device that's coming on in 2028, within the model, if you extended this model out indefinitely so it didn't end at 42, you would see the retirement of that battery in whatever year it retires. And you would then have to replace that generation.
So basically it's treated replace. I mean, it's basically like a greenfield replacement at the end of life is the cost assumption.
Well, the cost assumption, just to be clear, in this specific example in our modeling is, you know, if we're putting resources on in 2028, the life of the resource is going to extend beyond the planning period. But at the end of the planning period, you would essentially have to have an assumption if you modeled out beyond 20 years of what the replacement cost of that resource would be.
Okay, so then there's no embedded, I mean, so I think his point is like, is there some, you know, massive big cost out beyond 2042 that's not accounted for here?
Yeah, I don't know if the necessary is. Let's start with solar and wind generation. You know, we're looking at LCOE, right? So you're looking at the total embedded cost of that generation on a megawatt hour basis. That includes the full life cycle of that project. So if you had the solar generation, as an example, retiring in 2042, you would simply replace that LCOE stream with a new LCOE stream, which may actually be lower cost if you look at future technology improvements. When you apply the same logic to battery energy storage, again, we are capturing the full life cycle of that battery on a dollar per kW month basis. So at the end of that project, you would just have a replacement cost. So it wouldn't be like you suddenly have to go and spend another $100 million, because what you'd actually be doing is spend that $100 million, but recovering it over another 20 years, which would be exactly as we're modeling today. So in other words, the replacement chain, if you want to call it replacement chain, wouldn't have just a cost spike. It would be amortized over another 20 years.
Okay, I think that's very helpful clarification. If I were to summarize that, the batteries are treated like other new resource technologies as far as their life cycle and any replacement.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Athena started with a couple of questions. I think one came up before you showed the level 0 results, but I want to make sure Athena clears up anything about, you know, the adding storage versus the gas plants.
And that was really referring to the overall system that you showed us first, and just in general. I've seen that the effort is being made to meet the RPS requirements for carbon emissions, and some of it is sometimes thought to be injecting the carbon and using carbon capture and sequestration, and assuming it's 100%, and then totally ignoring the carbon that is emitted upstream, and methane being almost 200 times worse greenhouse global warming potential. I think it's not small. That's just a comment, which kind of goes on to the next part too, actually.
Yeah, so your next question had to do with solar versus wind and in the peak capacity accreditation.
Right. So when you showed us the ELCC, if I'm getting all my acronyms correct, during the summer peak, solar did much better than wind, providing the capacity and also for charging batteries. Would not it be, if you go then down to this last presentation where you're showing us what the projected system levels are going to be and the different resources added, it just seems like it would be adding more solar rather than wind. And is that, being considered, or is, I understand this bookend thing, but it seems like if people have an idea that wind is what's wanted, that's what they're going to offer.
Well, I think when you start looking at a scenario in which you can only add wind, solar, and batteries, essentially you need to add enough batteries to fulfill your capacity need, right? So then you take capacity accreditation kind of out of the mix. The batteries are so for that. So really what the equation becomes is, how do you charge those batteries at as low cost as possible? So now you're kind of disconnecting, you're disjointing the natural production profiles of resources and how to charge a battery. So all the models really seeing is saying, hey, wind, according to these assumptions and inputs, is a lower cost energy resource, and it produces more megawatt hours. So why would you not just charge those batteries overnight? And you've got thousands of megawatts of them, charge them with as low cost energy as possible, and then you discharge those batteries in the peak hours. Now, I think I started this presentation, Athena, earlier when I said, I actually feel like we're overestimating wind and underestimating solar in these analysis, because it's assuming all of that wind generation is available to that point. I think if you had a more balanced cost data assumptions for wind and solar, you would see a more balanced amount of resources being selected. You would see less wind being selected, more solar generation being selected. But just to be clear, if you just continuously add batteries to the system, the hour in which natural resources produce really goes out the window. You just need as cheap energy as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think you just said what I'm thinking anyways, so that's okay.
And that's in the balanced approach between
And that's in the balance of solar and wind.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem you get when you have very few resource options available for selection in the model. If you're really saying it's wind or solar, then the model is going to be very dependent upon those cost assumptions. So you could make a very slight adjustment to those cost assumptions, and the model is really going to swing the pendulum to the other resource. So that's why we said all along, when we come to do this IRP, when we create this statement of need, we really need to not be saying it's X amount of wind and Y amount of solar. We really need to be seeing what the actual market data is. So to me, for the purposes of the IRP, for the statement of need, we really need to be thinking of it as renewable energy. And when we see that RFP, we're really going to see the most cost-effective portfolio, or that most cost-effective mix of wind versus solar.
Right. And I do understand that this is all going to kind of be sort of semi-moot once you start getting RFPs, and I'm just confirming what I was thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to say one last thing, just because I do think it is kind of the most important thing we're trying to present today. As I go down to this last slide, I was very deliberate when we kind of make these statements of saying we've identified a need for variable energy resources between this range, and not trying to say it's this much wind and this much solar, because I think as we produce that statement of need, as we look at the action plan and the RFP, we really want to be kind of combining those two and saying, okay, it's a lot of renewable energy, you show me what the economics are.
Right.
Ben, can we maybe, and I'm going to take this out of question. Margie asked to follow up on this slide in particular, I believe, what the key takeaways are on the resource needs in 2030.
Yeah, because I'm having trouble tracking this with slide 32 to begin, which was the key takeaways from the existing technology case. Ben, right? That
Yeah.
So For dispatchable resources in this case, the need was 1380 megawatts for the 2024 RFP. That was, and then there was a parenthetical statement on that slide that said, once corrected, assume 1500. That's corrected for then accredited capacity. Is that why that number's different?
No, sorry, let me go back to that, Margie.
Yeah.
When I was presenting this presentation, I pulled the presentation that I had on my desktop, not the presentation that was on your website. This was a mistake that we had made in the initial modeling that I thought we had corrected in the final presentation. So this number, hopefully, as this presentation is shown on your website, would actually be firm and dispatchable or dispatchable resources. If you want to confirm that this is how it's shown on your website, if not, we will have to update. Once corrected, just to be clear, was a mistake that we had made in the initial graphs, just internally we had corrected.
Gotcha. So the 1500 assumed correction, that didn't apply.
Correct. That was just me thinking. I was just thinking, oh, that number should be about 1500, and then we went and confirmed it was 1380.
Okay. All right. And then so if you go back to the summary slide, at the end that we started showing, that's where the 1380. Okay, I'm tracking that, but I will go back to the site and make sure that that is the version we've had. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, my apologies for that.
Okay, next up was David Millar. David, are you online? Not hearing him. So Ben, his question is, other than the baseline, the other runs have a zero carbon by 2045 constraint. Is that okay? Is that correct?
No, that is not correct. Well, let me refine that. So when we look at the existing technologies case, for example, we have not forced the model to meet an RPS goal or have a zero carbon constraint. The way we've approached this is we do not allow any new carbon emitting resources in these cases. So if you're not allowing new carbon, there's no need to have a carbon constraint for new resources. We didn't force in the RPS requirement for the simple reason that's kind of challenging to do for multi-jurisdictional case. So we let the model initially just solve based on economics. And when we look at the results, we just go back and check the results. We actually far exceed the we actually far exceed the RPS requirements. So in this case, we didn't force the model to meet the RPS. We let the model solve naturally, and then went back and confirmed it is in compliance and actually far exceeds the RPS.
Okay, I'm not sure. David didn't weigh in, so I'm not sure if that confirms this question, but or maybe another way to put it, on this slide it says increasing to almost 97% in 2040. Your point is that it's some point throughout the whole time period there is some small fraction at the end of non-renewable generation.
I think by 2042, if this graph is to be believed, we get down to 3% of generation would be left on our legacy gas. When we get down to end of year 44, which would be the end of the, would be when the Energy Transition Act requires us to be carbon free, we would only have 2 generators left that are gas generators, which is Jones 3 and Jones 4, and those in service dates are going to be, or those retirement dates would be moved to 44. So there would be no carbon emissions at the end of 2044.
Let's see, David, you just jumped in. Ben was answering your question. Did you miss it?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Ben, can we do a quick takeaway, or I mean, this is recorded, so we can also go back.
Yeah, that's okay. You don't have to repeat for me. it's fine.
Okay. I think that the short answer is actually, it is zero carbon by 2045. That is what you just confirmed, Ben. But there's some
Correct.
small non-renewable generation up until the end, but small.
Correct.
Okay. Cynthia, you're up next. You had a question on long duration storage, particularly the pilot project with other Excel subsidiaries.
Yeah,
I believe there's two, if I'm not mistaken.
Ben, I didn't know that what I read in Utility Dive about the Form Energy project, the 10 megawatt, 1000 megawatt long duration storage that's supposed to be in service date of late 2025. I didn't understand that that was a pilot. I thought it was commercially viable, cost-effective project. Am I wrong?
Maybe I'll use my words differently because I'm not sure if we're using pilot. But that project.
It does say here in the news clip, I'm looking at it again, they are calling it a pilot project. So.
Yeah, so it was my understanding in Brooke jumping here that project was commission approved, but I don't think it was necessarily the result of a competitive RFP. And by that, I mean, I don't think they necessarily compared it to the cost of, say, a 4-hour battery. They just identified the need for long duration storage, identified the cost, and got commission approval.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Just to reiterate, I mean, your earlier slides show that you'd done a modeling run with long duration storage, as an option, and the model did not select it, right? And you're going to update that?
That's correct, yeah. So the model did not select it. And when we say update, what we're going to do is we're going to force a long duration project into the model. We know it won't be the most economical because by default, if it was the most economical, the model will select it, but at least it would quantify the cost impact because we feel like that's good information to provide the stakeholders. If it's $1 million more, maybe that's, not a huge sum. If it's $200 million more, that's a different story. So we just want to provide that information to stakeholders.
Jay, can you hear us?
Yeah. Is that Brooke? Is that the conference room?
Yeah.
Go ahead. It's hard to hear you though. Can you get closer to the microphone?
Is that better?
No.
Try again.
How about now, Jay?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay. Currently, there's one mic working. I was just going to say, I think characterizing the Form Energy projects as batteries, or I'm sorry, as pilots, is fair. That is not commercially available technology, but we hope that it will be after successful pilots in Colorado and Minnesota. We also have similar pilot projects with Ambry and other battery manufacturers and technologies. So just a little point of clarification there. And we can provide more information if stakeholders are interested in those projects in our other jurisdictions.
Cynthia, did you hear all that? I think that was Brooke's characterization of the projects in the other jurisdictions.
I did. That was helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Cynthia, you said you had another follow-up question on slide 41.
I thought I understood the slide. Now I'm confused. Is this Texas and New Mexico or simply New Mexico?
Ben, do you want to go? I think the answer is the changes by column.
Well,
Oh, excuse me, I was on mute.
Yeah.
So Cynthia, to your question, this would be total system resources. So this would assume there was no, we just continued to plan for one SPS system.
okay. And so is this like a 40-60 split, or can we say?
Oh,
Traditionally, was that someone from Excel who wants to take that question? Okay, hearing none, I'll go ahead and answer it. So Cynthia, traditionally it's been a little bit more Texas heavy from a sales perspective than New Mexico. You know, once you factor in the wholesale load, maybe it's kind of 50, 10, 40 in Texas's favor. I think as we look at where our load growth is occurring, with it specifically for the most part being in Southeast New Mexico, I think it's not a bad assumption just to assume they're pretty much equal from a high level analysis perspective.
So more like 50-50 is what you're saying.
50-50, yeah, probably fair.
Okay. These are big numbers. It's scary.
Yeah, I want to maybe just add, you know, because quite honestly, I think that, you know, these are very, very large numbers. You know, the majority of this kind of total capacity need is being driven by the wind generation. And as I mentioned earlier, when we start looking at these graphs, the wind generation, because of the cost that we're modeling from NREL, is really going to be front loaded. So, you know, if you see a very low cost resource out there, why not just go and procure it as soon as you can and reap the energy savings as soon as you possibly can? If we see that wind generation isn't quite as low in the RFP as we're modeling, you may see some of this wind generation being spread over a slightly longer period of time.
Okay, and that gets back to the nice exchange you and I had through emails a couple of weeks ago about how, when you educated me some on Encompass and how you can select resources in excess of the load requirements plus planning reserve margin.
Exactly. So when we talk about resource planning, everyone always has this kind of this misconception that you're solving to the peak plus the planning reserve margin. But really what Encompass is doing is it's just trying to solve the lowest cost solution while also meeting the planning reserve margin requirement. So if you can bring cheap energy online early and exceed the PRM, you know, have 25, 30% PRM, but that energy cost is so low, then the model is going to do that. The model is going to do what the lowest cost solution is to customers.
Okay, and then just to look at the graph on the, well, no, never mind. I get it. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to encourage anyone else to offer any questions in the chat or raise your hand. In the meantime, I do have a couple, and I have a couple follow-up questions that I think are quick.
Okay.
One is, if I understand, yeah, when you've shown the accredited capacity, these are all, sure I answer the question correct. This is all dealing, it's all dealing with the summer peak, right? Or I guess maybe the graph I was hoping, I wanted to check in on is, I think there's an earlier presentations you showed, I think there's the first modeling presentation, you showed an overbuilt, you know, a large increase in solar and storage met the summer peak far in excess, but the winter reserve margin, you know, it looked kind of tighter. And I take it you're still saying this is a summer peaking system, but I think, you know, we had you still need to maintain the system year round. And I just wanted to, you know, better understand that, how does the winter, basically how's the winter reserve and peak look with this addition and these additions as well?
Yeah, so yeah, I can provide that graph in our next meeting. I've got the 42 slides. I thought I was already boring people. So cut it out. But yeah, for the winter scenario, I think this is kind of a good graph that would probably demonstrate today what you're getting at. And this is the gas graph, so this is kind of the multi-jurisdictional baseline. And I mentioned earlier, we've kind of got our summer peak here shown in this dark line. And then we have this gas generation here that stays, you know, a few hundred megawatts lower than our peak, than our winter peak. So what we would probably see is this gas generation essentially is being built to meet our winter peak generation. So you start seeing all this gas essentially to meet our winter peak. And then the renewable resources, particularly solar, are really just piling on accredited capacity. In other words, you are adding dispatchable resources to meet your winter peak. And then the energy benefits of adding on solar and wind are contributing to you having a much greater summer peak than required. I'm going to rephrase that. If you start looking at the model and what it's solving to, maybe simpler terms, and you're modeling a 15% PRM, in the winter months, you're probably seeing us having accredited capacity that's near enough 15%, 15, 16%. As you start looking in the summer months, even though you've got a 15% requirement still, you may see us having 25%, 35% reserve margin. And that's because it's adding those resources because they're providing economical energy and not necessarily adding them just for capacity.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to read a comment that came in the meantime. All right, no, that's helpful. But if we looked at the graph, this is the multi-jurisdictional one. If we looked at the same one for the level 1 analysis with no gas, I guess, how does that, I think I understood the explanation. You're still gonna have enough storage to generally meet the planning reserve margin.
Yeah, so you'd probably see that pretty well in this graph if we showed, I know I definitely will show this in the next meeting, but if you look at the accredited capacity here, I can just change this chart, bear with me just for 1 second. That's a little bit easier to see. Oh, can I stop sharing then? Can you still see my screen?
Yes,
We can now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've just rearranged this chart slightly to what's on GridWorks' website to show the batteries below the renewables. But I think what you would see, Jay, is this is our summer peak. So you're going to see our winter peak, you know, a few hundred megawatts lower here. You're really going to see in these initial few years, in 28 through 30, you're going to see us probably tracking close to a 15% PRM peak. As you go out further into the future, then you're really adding batteries, not just for meeting summer and winter peak requirements, but you're also adding batteries for energy adequacy requirements. So if you don't have dispatchable generation, you don't have gas generation available, you're going to need to overbuild batteries in excess of the 15% PRM, regardless if it's summer or winter, because you need those resources to be able to take that wind generation in the evening and redistribute that wind, discharge that wind generation into the on-peak hours. So the further out you go, and as gas drops off the system, if you don't allow new gas being built, the 15% PRM starts to really go out the window. You start building more for energy adequacy than you do resource adequacy. So you probably exceed 15% in both the summer and the winter.
Okay, I think that helps. Well, David, you just sent a message in the chat. So if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. And yeah, sorry about before. So in the 2 New Mexico cases, there's no dispatchable gas chosen. So just, I know, I'm so sorry if you already answered this question, but were turbines allowed as candidate resources in those runs? And if you could, if they were, could you comment on why you don't think they were selected? And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so going back to this kind of hierarchy, what we've presented today is the existing technology in the long duration. And in neither of those scenarios was new gas generation allowed. So the model did not have the option of picking CTs, CCs, or any other gas technology. When we modeled the multi-jurisdictional baseline, this did include new gas generation, and it did select gas generation. So it's basically saying, if you just said, hey, you can build gas, that's going to be the most economical solution. When you start restricting it from building new gas, obviously it has no choice to build it. It's going to just pick storage, solar, and wind. Now, the one scenario we haven't presented today, because we're still working on gathering inputs and assumptions, is the hydrogen conversion. So this will be a New Mexico IRP scenario. In this scenario here, we will allow new gas generation. That gas generation, though, will incorporate blending and then full conversion to hydrogen, or would incorporate carbon capture to meet the ETA. So that scenario is still to come, but right now we do not have a scenario within the IRP scope that would just be basically allow gas and not have a path to be carbon free.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you.
Ben, I wanted to check. We had somebody on the phone wanted to ask a question. This is Mark again. So I wanted to check in, see if he could come off mute and ask this question. I didn't want to somehow not do justice to it from what I read. So Mark, can you possibly come off mute and ask your question to Ben? Okay, and we haven't. All right. All right. I'm going to do my best to give interpret his question correctly, but I believe what I understand, it was a question about, well, basically battery availability and particularly material availability. But I think there's a kind of broader question to this is, you know, if we take your 2030 scenario, you're talking about 1.38 gigawatts of new storage. At a time there'll be other high market demand for this, and what are you assuming about the availability of those, basically of that resource? It's available as large a quantity as you need when you need it.
Yes, so that's why, you know, as we look on slide 41, we have this kind of additional language at the bottom here. Actual capacity need is subject to firm pricing and resource availability. So we have to make an assumption that you know, in 2030 there is going to be 1,300 megawatts of battery storage available. Where I think we have the protection is obviously that's going to be subject to an RFP. And one, those technologies are going to have to be bid into the RFP. They're going to have to show they're available. So we're going to have firm pricing, firm schedule. And then obviously we can only select resources that are not available. So I think the 1,300 megawatts isn't a particularly risky scenario, but let's look at the wind just because I think that's, you know, a larger number. You know, we can assume that there's going to be 3,500 megawatts of wind available in 2030. If when we issue the RFP, there's not enough projects in the pipeline, then obviously we would see that in the RFP, and we would evaluate the projects that are available that can provide firm pricing at the time.
Okay, and then I guess, yeah, this has been a recurring question to me. It seems to me, given the near-term capacity need, if you don't, well, one, I mean, there's a point in time, a year plus from now, if you find out there's not enough capacity, or even more so in the course of selecting those projects, and they run into all sorts of problems, right? If there's delays along the line here, what other basically risk mitigation steps are you guys thinking about if things, you know, if you can't get that level of resource in the time frame?
Yeah, so I'll start with 2030. So I think that's a very different question from 2030 to 40. When we look at the resource need in 2040, it's extreme. When we look at 2030, this is definitely a big resource need. I'm not saying that. But we look at what's in the pipeline for projects, for new projects. We can look at the SPP DICES queue, for example. There's a lot of resources that are currently in development. So even though this resource need is very large, I think there's resources out there that are in the pipeline. Then when we start looking at our risk mitigation strategies, a lot of that's what comes into effect when we start evaluating the RFP. So when we evaluate the RFP, we're obviously looking at the strength of a project in terms of meeting their deliverables. So how good is this project for meeting their price and sticking to their price? How good is this project for meeting their in-service date and sticking to them in-service date? And there's going to be certain requirements we have. For example, in the last RFP, we were looking at projects that were far enough along their generator interconnection process with the SPP. That kind of limits the risk of some more sloppy projects, maybe projects that aren't going to be in service in time. Then when we look at selecting that portfolio, we're obviously going to look at selecting resources and then having somewhat kind of a contingency list of resources. So what happens if project X, Y, or Z fails? What do we do thereafter? So we'll have those resources selected. Also, we could potentially look at acquiring resources in excess of our PRM. If there's resources available, and perhaps we could add an extra battery to the system and proactively increase our reliability of the system without incurring too much cost. That's another path we may take. And then finally, we have kind of options with our existing portfolio of resources. We could look at potentially extending the retirement date of an existing gas steam unit. Maybe we've got a gas steam unit that's due to retire in 28 and we can retire it in 2030 as a backup option. And then the last resort is we could purchase capacity from the Southwest Power Pool, other members of the Southwest Power Pool. I really strongly advise against assuming there's going to be capacity out there that you can purchase from other LREs. Lots of other load responsible entities are also in the same position where they need a lot of new generation. So that certainly wouldn't be our default position. But if we got to a crunch and there was no extensions of existing generation available, there's no backup bids, then as a last resort, we can look at buying capacity from the market.
Okay. All good food for thought. Thanks, Ben. Margie had one question here. Margie, I don't know if you want to come online and ask it about slide 16.
Yeah, it's back to the assumptions, but it was just thinking about the action plan and these 2 periods where things have to be added. Ben, I was going back to slide 16 on the market energy prices and wondering if you could explain to folks what's happening in 2025 that causes this inflection in the on-peak and off-peak energy market prices from your perspective of modeling. I mean, what happens then that causes these various scenarios to occur?
And Margie, you're specifically asking kind of, can you see my cursor?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that 25.
You're asking in here.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll maybe refer to kind of my answer to Jeff Pollock earlier. These numbers are being provided by third parties. So we employ, well, we don't employ, we purchase data from S&P Global and Wood Mackenzie. So rather than me try and speculate on what's causing that short-term inflection, let me see if we can get some data from the people who provide these forecasts, and then I can answer both your question and Jeff's question from earlier, or provide some clarification for Jeff without trying to over speculate why we see this short-term blip.
Yeah, no, that would be great because that does really have a strong bearing on these 2. I mean, the action plan for this IRP and the next one, right? So that's why I thought, yeah, any more insight would be interesting to get. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the group here, either in the chat or by hand? Please raise your hand or. Okay, Ben, I just had one final one on the final resource mix.
Hi, this is Mark from Los Alamos.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Great. We got you. Yes. Please go ahead.
So I'm flying blind, so I apologize. I don't see any of the slides. So if I ask this question, it may be because you already have covered it. So thank you for the battery information you provided, but it appears that, have you done analysis of that, will battery material be available when you need to change out these batteries in 15 or 20 years? It is clear that a lot of other utilities are going to need the same battery material. So this could affect cost, potentially, as well as just basic availability. Have you considered that in your analysis? Maybe not financially, but just from a business point of view.
So, Mark, specifically, I just want to make sure I understand the question. Are you asking whether we considered the cost and availability of batteries as a result of the 24 RFP? Or are you saying when those batteries retire at some point in the 2040s, have we considered the availability and cost then?
So it's the later one, the 2040, which I understand is off in the future, but I mean, it is coming, and that is an assumption that you would have about availability.
Yeah, so no, our analysis stretches 20 years. So we're looking through the cost assumptions through 2043. So in regards to what happens after 2043, no, that's an extremely difficult question or analysis to try and conduct, because
I agree with you.
Yeah, and I'll just to say, Mark, if we start looking at what's going to happen 20 years from now, I suspect 4-hour lithium-ion battery in the early 40s is not going to be the technology we're replacing 4-hour lithium-ion batteries with today. So I think that's kind of, as we look into the future, we've got the optionality for, for hydrogen, whether that's, green hydrogen electrolysis. We've got the option for new types of chemistry for long duration batteries. We've potentially got the option for small modular reactors. So I hear what you're saying, I really do. But I think the economics are going to shift so much over the next 2 decades that's really difficult to try and capture today.
Agree with you. I just wanted to confirm, because that would be, if you could do that, then you wouldn't have to work at this job, basically.
Yes, exactly.
So thank you very much for your answer. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. And again, if there are other questions, please chime in. Ben, I just had the final one for me. If we look at your final resource, I think it was slide 41, like the 4,500 megawatt target for the variable renewables. And right now it's wind heavy, and it's come up several times. And your thinking is that's based on, you showed an NREL's assumption that the wind is cheaper than solar consistently. And if you find differently, if this was to be solar heavy, I would just want to put out, is it also worth thinking of having a megawatt hour target here as well, so that the megawatt hours are a consistent target to go after? If you did it just denominated in megawatts, you may end up short on the energy side if it was a more solar heavy portfolio.
Yeah, I am very glad you brought that up, Jake, because we actually, when I initially started putting together this presentation, that's exactly how we had these slides. We started showing kind of these dispatchable resources as a megawatt value, and the renewable energy resource is more of an energy value in a megawatt hour basis. So I don't disagree with you. We kind of try to keep it apples to apples just for ease in explaining this conversation, but certainly, when we come back at the end of August, maybe we do that presentation as both a megawatt value and then also an energy requirement.
Okay, that's consistent with how we did some of ours here, and it keeps it the most resource agnostic, right? But okay, that was my last comment. Question, so part question, part comment, observation. I want to go back to the group here. Anything further? Also want to make sure we check in with folks in Hobbs. For the folks in the room, any questions, comments?
I think so.
Okay. I think we have gotten through all the material, satisfied everyone's questions. I'm gonna turn it back over to Margie. I think we're fingers crossed slightly ahead of schedule.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We are ahead of schedule, and thank you for all the good questions and the great presentation by the SPS team. Really helpful to dig into that. I'll just note that we will check this evening and make sure that the final version of the SPS presentation is up on the GridWorks website. So we'll double check on that. We'd also like to ask you to all, maybe Deb, you can put back into the chat the link to not this one, but the previous link, which is the link to the the worksheet on factors. There's a website here for you, a link to go in, and please take a few minutes either now that we have a little extra time or this evening before 8 a.m. and put in your votes for your 5 priority needs interpreted based on how you interpret these. And if you have an idea that's not listed, you can put it in the other category. Please do that so that we can capture the results and present them to the group tomorrow. So unless there are other questions, we will leave the mic open for a few minutes in case people have questions or requests. Then we will reconvene at 9 a.m. Mountain Time tomorrow. You may have a question overnight that you think of on this topic, and the modeling results, the assumptions, we have time for those in the morning before we talk some more about the stakeholder requested modeling runs, and we present the results from this little worksheet to help inform the statement of need. So with that, any questions that folks have? Deb's got the link to this little worksheet in. Please take time to fill that out. And with that, we'll adjourn the meeting. Deb, let's leave the meeting open for another 5 minutes in case people do have questions or requests for us before we get ready for tomorrow's meeting. But thank you all for being here. Thank you for the great conversation and the input. And we will let you go for today. Thank you. Deb, can you put the link to the GridWorks website in the chat? I think Cisco Brink has asked for copies of the materials. So could you put that link into the chat again so where people can find all the information, please? think, Deb, you can stop the recording at this point, please.